Welcome to Black Screen Horror. Tonight, relax with true scary stories, gentle narration, and soothing rain. Close your eyes, embrace the darkness, and let the nightmares begin. If you enjoy the journey, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Sweet dreams, if you can. This happened to me about a number of years ago now, and I have genuinely never forgotten a single detail of it, no matter how much time has actually passed since it originally occurred. One night, as I was lying in bed trying to get some sleep, my black cat, Sabrina, scratched at my bedroom door, clearly wanting to be let outside for one of her usual late-night trips into the yard. I was tired, but still mostly awake, so I slipped out of bed and shuffled over to my door to let her out, moving on autopilot the way you do when you have gone through the exact same routine countless times before. However, instead of simply heading toward the usual spot she normally went, she looked directly at me and guided me instead toward the side door of the house, clearly wanting me to let her out through that particular exit instead of the one she usually used. Something that struck me as slightly unusual, even in that half-asleep state, though not unusual enough to actually stop and question it at the time. I followed her over to that side door and opened it up, then pushed the screen door out of the way so she could actually make her way outside. However, once I had closed the screen door behind her, I happened to glance out across the way, toward the side of our neighbor's house, which sits directly visible from that particular door. In the driveway, partially blocking a portion of their house from view, sat my dad's old 1995 Chevy truck, parked in its usual spot the way it always was. On the other side of my dad's truck, I saw a strange figure standing there by the hood, motionless, as though it had simply been waiting there for who knows how long before I actually happened to look over and notice it. I could only actually see it from its shoulders upward, the rest of its body hidden behind the truck itself, blocked from view by the hood and the front grille. It had a noticeably larger head than its body would have suggested, at least from what I could actually make out at that distance. Its neck looked thin and its shoulders looked bony, almost skeletal in their general shape and proportion, nothing about the overall silhouette matching anything close to a normal human build. Whatever this thing actually was, it had two large, completely empty eye sockets positioned exactly where eyes should have been, except there were no actual eyes present at all. They were pitch black, like two total voids set against its otherwise pale, almost sickly-looking skin, the kind of darkness that seemed to actually absorb whatever little light was available rather than simply reflecting nothing back at all. Now, the rest of its face is something I could never possibly forget, no matter how hard I might try over all the years since. It looked like the upper half of its face was still covered in some kind of intact skin, but the lower half, moving down toward where its jaw was located, looked genuinely shredded and torn apart, ragged in a way that looked painful and violent, even just to look at from that distance. Where the jaw itself sat, it was complete, exposed bone, nothing covering it at all, and it had this wide, unnervingly toothy grin stretched across that exposed jaw as it simply stood there, seemingly staring directly at me the entire time, unmoving, unblinking, its whole posture radiating a kind of patient, unhurried attention that felt far worse than if it had actually reacted or moved toward me in that moment. I should mention that I wear glasses specifically to help me see things at a distance clearly, and my first instinct was to assume maybe I was simply looking at some kind of blurred shape, perhaps the bushes near the neighbor's house or some other ordinary object that my eyes were simply misinterpreting from that distance, especially given how dark it actually was outside at that particular hour. So I squinted, trying to bring whatever I was looking at into sharper, clearer focus, genuinely expecting that small effort to resolve the whole thing into something completely mundane and forgettable. That only made everything considerably worse. I actually saw even more details of the creature once I squinted than I had been able to make out beforehand. Every single aspect of its appearance became more clear and considerably more detailed the harder I actually looked at it. The opposite of what should have happened under any normal circumstances involving distant, blurry shapes in the dark. The specific texture of its skin, the wrinkles across its face, the small bits of torn, ragged-looking flesh along its jawline, all of it came into sharper, undeniable focus. There was absolutely no mistaking what I was actually looking at anymore. Genuinely terrified at that exact point, I closed the side door immediately and locked it behind me as quickly as I possibly could, my hands fumbling and shaking slightly with the lock in my rush to actually get it secured properly. My breathing had become heavy and rapid and shallow all at once, my heart racing hard inside my chest, pounding loudly enough now that I could actually hear it clearly in my own ears. Even in that exact moment, I tried desperately and repeatedly to reason with myself, telling myself repeatedly that perhaps what I had actually just seen was simply not real, that my mind was simply playing some kind of trick on me in the dark, exhaustion and poor lighting combining to conjure something out of nothing. But I could not shake the image no matter how hard I tried. I knew, with absolute certainty, exactly what I had actually seen. Still deeply frightened, I ran straight into my room and jumped directly into my bed. I was already in my 30s at the time all of this happened, an adult with a mortgage and a full-time job, and yet I grabbed my blankets and hid completely underneath the covers the exact same way I might have done as a small child decades earlier. After all those years, I suddenly felt exactly the way I used to feel back when I was a kid, waking up from vivid night terrors. That specific fear of not being able to escape whatever horrors my own imagination might be conjuring up, feeling completely alone and vulnerable even though my own parents were sleeping just across the way in their own bedroom the entire time. Close enough that I could have called out to them if I had actually managed to find my voice. As I hid there underneath the blankets, I suddenly heard long, continuous scratching sounds against my wall, coming specifically from the direction where the creature had originally been standing outside, the sound cutting sharply through the otherwise total silence of the house around me. It sounded exactly like something was actually inside my room, dragging a nail slowly along the bumpy texture of my bedroom wall, moving with a deliberate, unhurried pace that somehow made it even more unsettling than if it had been fast or frantic. I could hear that same nail lightly thumping every single time it passed over one of the small bumps in the wall's surface, a steady rhythmic sound that I could not stop myself from counting. Half convinced that focusing on the pattern of it might somehow keep me from losing my mind entirely. My panic grew considerably worse, and I felt myself slipping further and further back into that same old childhood trauma, completely at its mercy all over again, despite being a fully grown adult at the time, who should have, by every reasonable measure, long since outgrown that specific kind of helpless terror. I started crying and tried desperately to talk myself out of the fear that had a genuine physical grip on me at that point. Maybe this thing fed specifically on fear itself, I remember thinking to myself in that moment. Maybe it was somehow getting some kind of twisted enjoyment out of my own terror, actively feeding off it for its own satisfaction. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself repeatedly that everything was going to be okay. As I slowly started to relax, just slightly, the scratching finally stopped entirely, and the whole house went completely quiet once again. After everything I had actually seen and experienced that night, I still continued trying to convince myself that I had simply been seeing things, desperately searching for any way to explain away what had just happened to me in some kind of rational, comforting terms. The following night, when Sabrina wanted to go back outside again, I reluctantly looked toward that same spot behind the hood of my dad's truck where I had originally seen the creature standing the night before, my heart already racing again, just from the anticipation of what I might see there. Nothing in that entire area looked anything at all like the creature I had witnessed, not even a single one of its distinctive features present anywhere I could actually see, just the ordinary shape of the truck and the quiet, empty driveway beyond it. That was the exact moment I finally settled the matter within myself, accepting fully that what I had actually seen the previous night had genuinely been real. And that particular realization scared me considerably more than the original sighting itself ever had, since it meant I no longer had the comfort of doubting my own eyes. I never, ever want to see that thing again for as long as I live. And I sincerely hope it never comes back to that spot or anywhere near my house ever again. Looking back on that entire experience now, years removed from the actual night it happened, I find myself replaying the specific sequence of events over and over in my head, trying to piece together some kind of explanation that would actually make sense of everything I witnessed and experienced that particular evening. The fact that Sabrina specifically guided me toward that particular door, the side door, rather than her usual spot, has always struck me as a detail worth examining more closely. Even though I recognize it could easily have been nothing more than an ordinary coincidence, cats being creatures of habit who sometimes simply change their preferred routine for reasons that have nothing to do with anything supernatural whatsoever. I have thought a great deal about the specific detail of squinting and seeing the creature more clearly rather than less clearly, since that particular detail has always struck me as one of the most genuinely unsettling aspects of the entire experience. Under any ordinary circumstances, squinting to try to bring a distant, blurry object into sharper focus should either clarify what you are actually looking at into something recognizable and mundane, or simply fail to change anything meaningfully at all. What should never happen, under any normal explainable circumstances, is for that same object to become considerably more detailed, more clearly defined, and more obviously monstrous the harder you actually try to focus on it. That specific detail alone has kept me from ever fully accepting any kind of simple, rational explanation involving distant shadows or blurred shapes from nearby bushes. The scratching sound against my bedroom wall afterward has also stayed with me powerfully over all the years since. That specific, deliberate, repetitive quality to it, the way it sounded exactly like something dragging a single fingernail slowly and methodically along the bumpy texture of my wall, over and over, without any real pause or variation in its rhythm. I have wondered, more than once, whether that sound was actually coming from directly outside my window, positioned near wherever the creature had originally been standing, or whether it had somehow genuinely found its way inside my own house entirely, moving along the interior wall of my bedroom itself while I hid there underneath my blankets, too frightened to actually check and confirm one way or the other. I have also thought a great deal about that specific idea that crossed my mind in the moment. The thought that this creature might have actually been feeding on my own fear, deliberately drawing out and prolonging its presence specifically because of how terrified I clearly was in that moment. Feeding off it the way some kind of parasite might feed off a host without the host ever fully understanding what was actually happening to them. I do not know where that particular thought originally came from, whether it was simply my own panicked mind grasping for some kind of explanation in the moment, or whether it reflected some kind of genuine, instinctive understanding of what I was actually dealing with that night. some deeper part of me recognizing the truth of it even before my conscious mind could properly catch up. Either way, that thought has never fully left me since, resurfacing every time I happen to think back on that entire experience in any real detail, always circling back around to that same unsettling question of whether something out there had genuinely been drawing strength from my own fear that night. The fact that I felt myself regressing so completely back into that same childhood fear response, hiding under my blankets the exact same way I used to as a small child experiencing night terrors, has always struck me as a particularly telling detail about just how genuinely, deeply frightening that entire experience actually was. I had not felt that specific kind of helpless, childlike terror in decades by that point in my adult life, and having it come rushing back so completely and so immediately, triggered by a single sighting outside my own side door, told me clearly just how far beyond ordinary, everyday fear that entire experience actually extended. I never did tell my parents about what had actually happened that night, at least not in any real, detailed way, mostly out of a genuine fear that they would simply assume I had imagined the whole thing, or had some kind of unusually vivid, overactive dream that had felt more real to me than it actually was. Looking back now, I sometimes wish I had actually told them everything in full detail at the time, if only to have another person aware of what had happened. Someone else who might have been willing to help me keep watch or simply validate that my own fear and my own memory of that night were genuinely justified. I have also occasionally wondered whether Sabrina herself sensed something about that creature that I simply was not able to perceive myself, given how deliberately she guided me toward that specific door rather than her usual spot, and given how she went on to spend time outside that same night without ever showing any obvious signs of distress or fear herself once she was actually outside. Cats are famously perceptive animals in general, often reacting to presences or energies that remain completely invisible or undetectable to human senses, picking up on things well before their owners ever manage to notice anything at all. And I have wondered, more than once, whether her own apparent calm that particular night meant she genuinely did not perceive that creature as any kind of real, genuine threat toward her specifically, even if it clearly represented something genuinely dangerous or deeply unsettling as far as I myself was concerned that night. I have told a small handful of people about this experience over the years since it happened, and the reactions I have gotten have varied quite a bit depending on who I happened to be talking to at the time and how seriously they generally take these kinds of stories in the first place. Some people have immediately suggested some kind of simple, mundane explanation. Poor lighting playing tricks on my eyes, an unusual shadow cast by the truck itself, combined with the specific angle of whatever streetlight happened to be nearby, or even simple exhaustion distorting my own perception in the middle of the night after being woken up out of a sound sleep. I understand completely why people default to that kind of explanation, and I do not necessarily blame them for reaching for the most comfortable, rational answer available to them. But having actually lived through the experience myself, standing right there at that door, watching that creature grow more detailed and more clearly monstrous the harder I actually focused on it, I remain genuinely unconvinced that any purely mundane explanation fully accounts for everything I actually witnessed that particular night. To this day, I still keep a careful eye on that same general area whenever I happen to be out near that side door after dark. Some small, persistent part of me always half expecting to see that same creature standing there again, waiting patiently by the hood of whatever vehicle happens to be parked in that same spot at the time, unmoving and watchful the exact same way it had been that first night. It has never happened again, not once, in all the years since that original sighting, and I remain deeply, genuinely grateful for that fact every single time I think back on it. But the specific memory of that night, the empty eye sockets, the exposed jawbone, that wide, unnervingly toothy grin stretched across a face that should never have looked the way it did, has never once faded from my mind, and I suspect it never fully will. No matter how many more years continue to pass between me and that single unforgettable encounter that changed, in some small but permanent way, how safe I have felt stepping outside my own home after dark ever since. I was around 11 years old when this happened, an age where I still trusted, without question, that my own bedroom was the single safest place in the entire world for me to be. And I woke up suddenly, in the middle of the night, to find a man straddled directly on top of me. His hand pressed down firmly over both my mouth and my nose at the very same time, making it hard for me to breathe properly or make any sound at all in that first genuinely disoriented instant of waking up out of a deep, ordinary sleep. He told me firmly to roll over and not scream, his voice low and direct in a way that left absolutely no room whatsoever for any misunderstanding exactly how genuinely serious the entire situation actually was in that moment. That tone alone communicating a level of real threat that my 11-year-old mind had genuinely never once had to process before that exact terrifying moment. I managed to roll myself completely off the bed and onto the floor below, and I tried to scream as loudly and as desperately as I possibly could, the kind of scream people sometimes describe as screaming bloody murder. I say tried specifically because when you are genuinely, truly terrified in a moment like that, it can actually take a second or two to find your own voice again, your body freezing up in a way that makes even something as basic as screaming feel temporarily impossible, no matter how badly you actually want to do it. No matter how urgently your mind is already screaming at your own throat to, just make some kind of sound. My mom heard me screaming from somewhere else in the house and came rushing into my room immediately, still half asleep herself, but instantly alert the moment she registered what she was actually hearing, and she got into a physical fight with the man who had broken in without a single moment of hesitation. He was at least 6 feet tall, and my mom stood only about 5'3", but somehow, between her fighting back physically and both of us screaming as loudly as we possibly could, she managed to scare him enough that he ultimately gave up and fled straight back out the same window he had originally used to break into my room in the first place. He was never caught, not that night and not at any point afterward, as far as I know, despite everything the police attempted to do in the days and weeks that followed. I have thought about that night more times than I could possibly count over all the years since it actually happened, turning the entire sequence of events over in my mind again and again, trying to make sense of something that, even now as an adult, still genuinely defies any kind of easy explanation. Waking up to someone else's weight pressing down on top of me, a stranger's hand clamped over both my mouth and my nose at once, is a sensation I do not think I will ever fully be able to describe properly to anyone who has not actually experienced something similar themselves. The sheer physical wrongness of it burned into my memory with a clarity that has never once faded with time. That specific, immediate loss of control over my own breathing in the very first seconds of waking up, before I had even had a chance to fully process what was actually happening to me, remains one of the most frightening physical sensations I have ever experienced in my entire life. I remember that first split second of confusion clearly. The strange, disorienting gap between being deeply asleep and suddenly finding myself pinned down by someone considerably larger than me. My brain struggling to catch up with what my body was already instinctively reacting to before I had even fully opened my eyes. I think that brief delay, that momentary struggle to actually process what was happening and to find my own voice again, is something people who have never actually lived through a genuinely terrifying moment like that often do not fully understand or expect. You would think that pure instinct alone would make you scream immediately the moment you sense real danger. But in my own experience, genuine terror does not always work quite that simply or that quickly. Sometimes your entire body locks up first, your mind racing far faster than your voice is actually able to keep pace with in that same critical moment, leaving you trapped for a few agonizing seconds inside your own paralyzed body. Rolling off the bed and onto the floor was not some kind of carefully planned, deliberate escape tactic on my part. It happened almost entirely on instinct, my body simply reacting to the immediate, overwhelming need to get away from the weight pressing down on top of me, without any real conscious thought behind the actual movement itself, my limbs moving before my mind had even caught up to what was happening around me. Looking back now, I recognize that instinct probably played a genuinely significant role in how the rest of that entire night ultimately played out, giving me just enough space and just enough separation from him to actually start finding my voice again and screaming as loudly as I possibly could once I finally hit the floor. I have thought a great deal over the years since about the specific sound of my own mom bursting into that room, the sudden shift from being completely alone with that man to suddenly having her there fighting for me with everything she had. That single sound of her footsteps rushing down the hallway toward me, one of the most comforting sounds I have ever heard in my entire life, even wrapped up as it was in the middle of everything else happening. I do not remember every single detail of that physical fight itself with perfect clarity. My own memory of that specific stretch feeling somewhat fragmented and disjointed even now. The way memories from moments of extreme fear so often end up being, entire seconds seeming to blur together into a single, continuous rush of noise and motion. But I remember the fact of it happening with absolute certainty. The sound of the struggle, the sheer intensity of both of us screaming together at the top of our lungs, and the eventual overwhelming relief of watching him actually retreat and disappear back out through that same window he had come in through. The height difference between my mom and that man has always stuck with me as one of the most remarkable details of that entire night, whenever I actually stop to think it through properly and picture the two of them facing off against each other in that dark room. He stood well over 6 feet tall, easily a foot taller than my own mother, who stood only 5'3" by comparison. And yet she did not hesitate for even a single second before physically engaging with him directly, throwing herself bodily into that fight without any apparent concern for her own considerable size disadvantage. I think about that specific detail often, the sheer immediate willingness she showed to protect me despite how genuinely dangerous and how physically mismatched that entire confrontation actually was for her personally. A willingness that has stayed with me as one of the clearest examples of real courage I have ever personally witnessed. I do not know, even now, exactly what allowed her to actually succeed in scaring him off the way she ultimately did. Whether it was purely the combined intensity of our screaming together or the unexpected physical resistance he encountered the moment he actually had to deal with another adult in the room rather than simply an 11-year-old child he had assumed would be considerably easier to control and overpower without any real difficulty. Whatever the actual combination of factors was, something about that fight, about our combined screaming and her willingness to physically confront him, despite how much larger he was than her, was ultimately enough to convince him that continuing forward was no longer worth whatever risk he had originally calculated. when he first broke into that window earlier that same night. The fact that he was never actually caught, not that night, and not at any point in all the years since, has remained one of the most unsettling, unresolved details of the entire experience for me personally. I have spent considerable time over the years wondering who he actually was, what had originally drawn him specifically to our house that particular night, and whether he ever attempted anything similar again afterward, either in our same general area or somewhere else entirely once he presumably realized our particular house was no longer a safe target for him to return to. My relationship with sleep itself changed permanently after that night, in ways that have taken me years to fully process and work through properly, long after I might have otherwise expected any lingering effects to have naturally faded away on their own. For a long stretch of time afterward, I found myself waking up at the smallest, most insignificant sounds, my whole body snapping instantly into full alertness at even the faintest creak or shift somewhere else in the house, my mind immediately racing through the worst possible explanations before I could even fully register what I had actually heard, my heart already pounding before I was even fully conscious enough to reason through it. I do not think that particular hyper-awareness around sleep and nighttime sounds has ever fully, completely left me, even decades removed now from that single, terrifying night. Windows in particular have always carried a very specific, heightened significance for me ever since that experience. Something I do not think most people who have never lived through anything similar could ever fully understand or relate to on the same level. I check window locks obsessively every single night, regardless of where I happen to be sleeping, whether in my own home or somewhere else entirely, a habit that has never once faded or lessened in intensity across all the years since that original night. No matter how many times I try to consciously remind myself that the odds of anything similar ever happening again are genuinely, statistically low. I know, logically, that this particular habit likely goes considerably beyond what most people would consider a reasonable, proportionate level of caution. But I have never once been able to convince myself to actually let it go, not even partially, not even after all this time. I have talked about that night with my mom many times over the years since it originally happened, and her own memory of the physical fight itself has always struck me as remarkably clear and detailed, far more so than my own fragmented recollection of that same stretch of time, almost as though the adrenaline of actually fighting him had etched every single moment permanently into her memory, in a way mine simply never managed. She has told me more than once that she does not even fully remember consciously deciding to fight him, that her entire body simply reacted the moment she heard me screaming, some deep instinctive maternal drive completely overriding any kind of rational calculation about her own considerable size disadvantage compared to him. She has told me she would have done exactly the same thing again, without a single moment of hesitation, regardless of how much larger or how much more physically dangerous he actually was compared to her own smaller frame, a statement she has repeated to me with the exact same conviction every single time the subject has ever come up between us since. I think about how differently that entire night could have ended if my mom had not happened to hear me screaming when she did, or if she had hesitated for even a few additional seconds before actually coming into my room to help me directly. I try very hard not to dwell too heavily on those particular thoughts, but they do still resurface every so often. Usually late at night, when the house around me happens to be especially quiet and still, my mind drifting unbidden toward versions of that night that ended very differently than the one I actually lived through. I am endlessly, genuinely grateful that she heard me exactly when she did, and that she did not hesitate for even a single moment before doing everything within her power to protect me from whatever that man had originally intended to do to me that night. I have wondered more than once over the years whether that man had specifically targeted our house deliberately, whether he had been watching our property for some period of time beforehand, learning our particular routines and habits well enough to know exactly which window led into a child's bedroom, or whether it had simply been some kind of random opportunistic choice on his part. Our house simply happening to be the one he decided to target that particular night, for reasons that had nothing specifically to do with either my mom or me directly. I do not know the answer to that question, and I doubt I ever fully will, given that he was never actually caught or identified afterward, leaving that particular question permanently, frustratingly unanswered for the rest of my life. A small but persistent piece of unfinished business I will simply have to learn to carry around indefinitely. The police did come out to our house afterward, once everything had actually settled down enough for my mom to actually call them in, and they took statements from both of us about everything that had happened, dusting for fingerprints around the window frame and looking for any other physical evidence that might have helped identify him afterward, walking carefully around the yard beneath my window with flashlights searching for footprints in whatever soft ground they could find. I do not know whether anything they actually found ever led anywhere concrete, since I was young enough at the time that most of those specific investigative details were kept largely from me. My parents likely trying to protect me from unnecessary additional details on top of everything I had already gone through that same night. A decision I have always understood and appreciated even without knowing the full extent of what that investigation actually turned up. I have thought, many times over the years since, about how genuinely fortunate I was that my mom happened to be home that particular night, and that she happened to be a light enough sleeper to actually hear me screaming clearly enough to come running immediately, without any delay at all between the sound reaching her and her already being on her feet moving toward me. I do not know how differently everything might have played out if she had been away for some reason that night, or if she had simply been too deep asleep herself to actually register what she was hearing quickly enough to intervene in time. A version of that night I have deliberately never let myself think through in too much detail. Even now, all these years later, that particular thought has never fully left me, even decades removed now from the actual night itself. I have also thought, over the years, about how that entire experience shaped the way I eventually came to think about safety more generally, well beyond just windows and locks specifically. It made me considerably more attentive to my surroundings in almost every single context, more likely to notice an unlocked door or an unfamiliar noise than I imagine most people my age tend to be on any given ordinary day. A heightened awareness that has occasionally felt like a burden, but that I have also come to recognize as something genuinely useful in its own right. A form of vigilance I did not choose, but that has served me well more than once since. I do not know whether I would have developed that same level of awareness naturally on my own, given enough time and enough ordinary life experience, or whether it is something I only ever developed specifically because of that one particular night. But either way, it has become such a permanent part of how I move through the world that I honestly cannot imagine what it would feel like to move through life without carrying it anymore. I still think about that entire experience regularly, even now, so many years after it actually happened, the memory resurfacing unprompted at the strangest, most unrelated moments during an otherwise completely ordinary day. A fragment of that night, arriving without any warning at all, and then just as quickly receding again once I managed to steady myself. I do not know if that particular reaction will ever fully go away completely, and at this point in my life, I have mostly made peace with the possibility that it simply never fully will. That this experience has simply become a permanent part of who I am and how I move through the world, whether I actually want it to be or not. What I do know, with absolute certainty, is that my mom's willingness to fight for me that night, despite every single physical disadvantage stacked against her, remains one of the single most significant acts of love and protection I have ever personally witnessed or experienced in my entire life, and it is something I have never once taken for granted in all the years since. A debt of gratitude I do not think I will ever be able to fully repay her, for no matter how many years continue to pass between us from here on out. Back when I worked for a security company, one of my regular duties involved handling nightly rounds through an old, deteriorating building that used to serve as both a newspaper printing press and the office space for the journalists who worked there. A place that still carried a strange, faded dignity to it, despite years of decline. Most of the time, I ended up doing these rounds somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, right in the dead center of the night when the whole city outside seemed to have gone completely still. The building had 5 separate floors, and scattered across each level were small metal cylinders mounted onto the walls and door frames, which required me to use a piece of equipment called a deggy stick, pressing it against each individual point as I moved through the space. This process registered back to the main office automatically, proving that I had actually completed the full walk through every single floor from end to end, rather than cutting corners anywhere along the way. Certain sections of the building stayed lit even overnight, mostly left over from daytime work crews servicing the electrical panels or tearing up sections of flooring as part of some ongoing renovation that never quite seemed to reach completion no matter how many months passed. During these overnight rounds, I was always completely alone in that building. Not another living soul anywhere on any of the 5 floors besides me. The place carried a genuine biting chill inside at that particular point in the winter. The kind of cold that settles into old, poorly heated structures once the sun goes down and never quite lifts again until morning. Walking through a massive, empty building in total, dead silence was, I will freely admit, more than a little creepy in its own right, even setting aside anything unusual that eventually happened. The whole space smelled old and stale, that distinct musty odor that clings to buildings that have sat mostly unused for a long stretch of time. Every now and then I would catch some strange, unexplained noise drifting through the halls, though nothing that ever struck me as particularly serious in those earlier weeks of the job. For the most part, I felt reasonably okay moving through that building during my shifts, with exactly one exception. Floor 3. One end of that specific floor stayed lit by a single overhead light positioned near the staircase, while the other end, stretching out roughly 10 or 15 yards, sat in total, complete darkness. The kind of blackness that seemed to swallow the beam of my own flashlight before it could travel very far into it at all. Whenever I made my way down that particular hallway, which only ever let you turn left, connecting into another hallway that eventually opened up into a wide space filled with short, segmented cubicle dividers, clearly once a functioning office area, and further along from there, a set of dark, doorless bathrooms that genuinely resembled something straight out of a horror game, I always felt this heavy, persistent sense of dread settle over me. A dread that never once lifted, no matter how many times I actually made that same walk. Genuinely, deeply uneasy. That specific sensation people describe when they say it felt like they were being watched, that was exactly what I experienced every single time I made my way through that stretch of floor 3. A heavy, pressing feeling that never once eased up, no matter how many times I tried telling myself I was simply imagining it. One particular night, while walking through the darkness there, I felt something brush against the back of my neck. I immediately swatted at it, assuming a spider or some other bug had landed on me in the dark. There was nothing there. I ran my flashlight over every inch of the area around me and found absolutely nothing that could explain what I had just felt. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up, and I bolted, completely abandoning the final deggy point I still needed to hit. A point that would have required me to walk the entire stretch of that same dark hallway, through a door into another pitch-black room, hit the checkpoint, and then retrace my steps all the way back through that same unsettling hallway toward the light. As I glanced back over my shoulder while running, I swear I saw some kind of shadowy mass shifting near those same dreaded bathrooms, just for a split second, before it vanished from view entirely. Later that same night, I went to check in on a guard stationed at a different location. Someone who, as it turned out, had actually worked inside that exact same building 4 years earlier, back when it was still fully staffed with employees going about their normal workday, everything running exactly as it had once been intended. I mentioned the building casually to him during our conversation, telling him a bit about my own recent experiences there over the past couple of weeks. I said something along the lines of, "Yeah, I get some strange, unsettling vibes on," and before I even finished the sentence, he cut straight in and said, "The third floor." I was completely stunned, my sense of unease shooting up so fast it practically broke the meter. I asked him to explain exactly what he meant by that before I told him anything else at all about my own encounter that same night. He told me a woman had died by suicide on that exact floor, years earlier, back when the building was still fully staffed and operating exactly as it had originally been intended. Her husband had left her, and during an ordinary workday, she had gotten up from her desk without any warning to anyone around her, walked over to the window, and jumped, landing in the parking lot below with devastating, fatal force, right in front of horrified coworkers who happened to be looking out at the wrong moment. Not long afterward, the women who worked on that floor reportedly refused to stay in the building past 4 in the afternoon, and every single one of them made a point of avoiding those same bathrooms entirely, no matter how badly they needed to use them during the workday. They apparently reported hearing voices and catching glimpses of shadows out of the corners of their eyes, along with several other unsettling details he only briefly touched on before moving past it. He told me he used to handle rounds in that building himself, though usually only during regular daytime hours when the place was still bustling with normal activity and plenty of coworkers around to keep him company. But one particular night, he had stayed late and ended up doing rounds after everyone else had already gone home for the day. He said he felt those exact same unsettling vibes I had just described to him. And he claimed that on that specific night, he had shined his flashlight directly toward the bathrooms and reportedly saw a tall, black figure, slightly hunched over, standing motionless in the hallway with its back turned toward him, peeking over its shoulder in his direction as though it already knew he was there, watching. He told me he bolted out immediately and never went back onto that floor again, or at the very least, never went anywhere near those bathrooms again for the remainder of his time working there afterward. To give you a clearer picture of why those bathrooms felt so genuinely unsettling, they sat right next to each other, and neither one actually had a door attached at all. Whenever I shined my flashlight into that total darkness, all that came back was the glare of stained, dirty mirrors, unsettling white porcelain sinks, white tiled flooring, and shadows bouncing strangely across the walls in ways that never quite lined up with anything actually standing in front of me at the time. If you have never seen it yourself, I would genuinely recommend pulling up a clip on YouTube of the hallway and bathroom scene from the video game Outlast 2, since it captures that same specific atmosphere almost perfectly. The layout and atmosphere are strikingly close to what I am describing here in nearly every important detail. Just those images alone are enough to raise the hair on your arms. I already knew, deep down, that this particular building was going to mess with me psychologically the longer I kept doing rounds there night after night. But there was simply no way around it whatsoever. Our company was contracted to have a guard walk the full grounds twice daily, every single day, without exception. And I was the one who ended up assigned specifically to the overnight shift. So naturally, my next scheduled visit to that building was not something I was looking forward to at all, dreading it in a way I had never dreaded any part of that job before. Several days passed after that first incident without anything particularly eventful happening, though the tension of simply waiting for something to happen was almost worse than the incident itself had been. But that persistent sense of dread never actually let up, only continued to build steadily the more time I spent there. Finally, one night, I worked up whatever nerve I could gather and said out loud, into that same dark hallway, "If anyone is in here, make your presence known right now. Stop messing with me." Nothing happened. I kept moving down that same dark hallway, through the door into that pitch-black room at the far end, flashlight steady in hand, hit my checkpoint, and made my way back through the hallway, passing those same bathrooms, before turning right into the dark open cubicle area beyond. Suddenly, the temperature around me dropped fast, and I froze completely in place, every muscle in my body locking up at once. I genuinely cannot explain it, but I got this overwhelming, sinking feeling that something was standing directly behind me, close enough that I almost imagined I could feel its presence pressing against my back. I understand that typically, when people describe encounters with ghosts or demons, it usually ends up being nothing more than a trick of the light, or their own mind inventing something that was never actually there, their perception quietly bending to match whatever they already half expected to see. I have personally had that exact kind of thing happen to me before, on other occasions. But this was not one of those instances. I was completely awake, alert, and lucid the entire time. I had never particularly believed in the paranormal or anything demonic before that point in my life. I was not a religious person at all, and never had been, even growing up. Any earlier time I thought I might have seen a ghost or spirit, I had always managed to talk myself into some reasonable explanation. A shadow, pipes creaking somewhere, a house settling, a dog barking outside in the distance, that kind of thing. Believe me, I tried over and over afterward to rationalize what I am about to describe, but I genuinely cannot manage it. I was as much a skeptic as any working scientist you could ever hope to find. What I was about to confront that night was absolute, fully formed, and by no means some trick of the light or a flicker caught in my peripheral vision. I started walking faster, silently praying I would reach the end of that darkness quickly. My gut kept telling me over and over, "Do not turn around, do not turn around." But I had to. I could not stand not knowing any longer. So, I turned. I looked back into the darkness. I shuddered immediately and jumped backward. What I saw was a black, deeply black figure, darker than even the darkest corners of that already dark floor by a significant margin, with frizzy hair, standing tall, with arms noticeably longer than any ordinary man's arms should ever reasonably be. And in that split second of pure adrenaline, what looked like unusually long fingernails or claws extending from its hands curled in a way that looked distinctly unnatural, even in that terrible light. At first, I genuinely could not believe what I was looking at. My rational brain immediately tried to deduce that I must simply be staring at some tall, homeless man or woman hiding out in the building. I even called out, "Hello," into the darkness. I was frozen, completely in place, my heart pounding hard enough that it felt like it might punched straight through my own chest. This thing, still and completely silent up to that point, suddenly bent down, dropped onto all fours, and started running directly at me at full speed, closing the gap between us far faster than anything with that shape should have reasonably been able to. The specific way it moved in that split second is something I have never fully been able to describe properly since. Short, incredibly fast strides, almost like watching a crippled dog chasing after a mail carrier. Quick and jerky and utterly wrong in a way that made no biological sense to me whatsoever. Nothing about the rhythm of it resembling anything a living creature should actually be capable of. I turned and sprinted as hard as I possibly could toward the exit door, moving so fast that I actually fell forward and slammed myself directly into the door itself, my shoulder taking the full impact. I managed to push it open and run outside, but I turned around one final time and shined my flashlight directly back toward the spot where I had just encountered this thing. There was a support beam running from the floor up to the ceiling with an electrical breaker box attached to it. The door of that breaker box was flapping back and forth on its own, banging loudly every time it struck the beam, the same repeating clang echoing through the empty hallway. I stood there and watched until it finally stopped. Something had clearly slapped or struck it hard enough to set it swinging that way. You could argue the wind from my own running might have caused it, but that box sat a good 15 feet away from where I had actually passed by, and on the completely opposite side of that beam. There was no reasonable way that could have happened purely from me running past it. After that particular night, I still had no choice but to keep doing rounds inside that building. It was simply my job, and there was no realistic way around it, no matter how badly I wanted to quit. But from that point forward, I always wore headphones with music turned all the way up, and I sprinted from one end of that floor to the other as fast as I possibly could every single time I passed through it. Weeks later, I finally stopped in the middle of that same darkness one more time and called out loud for whatever it was to leave me alone entirely, telling it flatly and firmly that I refused to communicate with it any further under any circumstances at all. To this day, since everything that happened that particular night, I have never once encountered anything I would personally call genuinely paranormal again. But that night, that thing I saw in the darkness, I will never forget it as long as I live. It was real. It was filled with something that felt unmistakably like pure hatred, and I remain completely convinced, even now, that it genuinely wanted to hurt me, or possibly kill me outright, given the chance. I have spent a lot of time since leaving that job entirely thinking about what that thing might have actually been, whether it was somehow tied to the woman who had died on that same floor all those years earlier, some corrupted, twisted echo of that tragedy still lingering there long after everyone else had moved on, or whether it was something else entirely. Something that had simply chosen that particular building and that particular floor as a place to settle regardless of whatever history the space already carried before it ever arrived. The fact that the other guard had described that exact same tall, hunched figure near those same bathrooms, years before I ever set foot in that building myself, has always been the one detail that keeps me from writing the whole experience off as nothing more than an isolated hallucination brought on by exhaustion or frayed nerves from working the overnight shift alone in a genuinely unsettling old building. Neither of us had ever spoken about it beforehand at all, and yet our two separate descriptions matched almost perfectly, right down to the exact posture and the way it seemed to be watching from over its own shoulder. I still think, more than anything else, about the sheer wrongness of the way that thing moved once it actually charged directly at me, dropping suddenly onto all fours and covering ground with those short, rapid, jerky strides that looked nothing at all like how any human body could ever actually move on its own. That single detail has stayed lodged in my memory more vividly than almost anything else from that entire night, resurfacing at the strangest, most unrelated moments even now, years after I left that job behind for good. I do not know what that thing actually was, and at this point, I have made a kind of uneasy peace with never finding out for certain. Some things, I have come to believe, are simply better left unexplained and undisturbed, exactly the way I ultimately left that building and that job behind me once and for all. People genuinely would not believe me if I told them everything I've actually witnessed over the years. I swear, I have seen some of the most insane, unexplainable things imaginable. The kind of experiences that sound completely made up the moment you try to describe them out loud to someone who was not actually there to see it happen alongside you. The kind of story that gets you those polite, humoring nods from people who clearly think you are either exaggerating or losing your grip on reality. One particular incident I actually managed to capture on video at the time, but rewatching it afterward left me so genuinely disturbed that I ended up deleting the footage entirely, unable to stand having it sitting there on my phone or my computer, always just one accidental tap away from seeing it again. Demonic encounters. Plural, multiple. Not just one isolated incident either, but multiple repeated experiences over time, each one somehow managing to feel more unsettling than the last, building on top of each other until I genuinely started questioning whether the world I thought I understood was anywhere close to the actual, complete picture. One of these encounters in particular involved a young man who I genuinely believed became possessed right in front of me, and during that possession, he actually tried to strangle me to death with his own hands. I have seen a dead human being before as well, and his eyes in that moment went the exact same strange, unnatural way that this young man's eyes did during his possession. And then, once whatever demon or entity had been controlling him actually left his body, his eyes suddenly lit back up again, flooded with genuine, overwhelming fear, and he began screaming in agony directly into my face, because he had just felt his own body go through a completely unwarranted, forced takeover, and he had absolutely no idea what he had actually done to me while that thing was in control of him. I want to walk you through this entire experience as clearly and completely as I possibly can, because it remains, even now, one of the single most terrifying and genuinely inexplicable things I have ever lived through in my entire life. It happened during a period when I was spending a significant amount of time around people who were, to put it plainly, dabbling in things they probably should not have been dabbling in, experimenting with rituals and practices that none of us fully understood the actual weight or consequences of at the time. We were young, curious, and honestly a little reckless about the whole thing, treating what we were doing as more of a thrilling hobby than anything genuinely dangerous. The young man in question, who I will simply refer to here without using his real name, was someone I had known for a while by that point. Someone who had always struck me as a completely normal, easygoing person under any ordinary circumstances. The kind of guy who made everyone around him laugh without even really trying. Always the first to check in on someone else in the group if they seemed a little off. Nothing about his baseline personality ever suggested he was capable of sudden, extreme violence, and nothing about our relationship up to that point had ever given me any reason to feel unsafe around him. That context matters enormously for understanding just how shocking and disorienting everything that happened afterward genuinely was, since this was not some volatile stranger or someone with a history of aggression, but a genuine friend who I had spent countless ordinary, unremarkable evenings with before that particular night. On the particular night everything unfolded, we had gathered together as a small group, the way we often did during that period, engaging in the kind of activity that, looking back now, I recognize as being considerably more serious and more dangerous than any of us treated it as being at the time. The way you sometimes only understand the true weight of a decision well after it has already been made and cannot be taken back. We had gathered in a somewhat isolated setting, comfortable and familiar to all of us, the kind of place we had used for similar gatherings many times before, without a single moment of concern crossing any of our minds. I do not want to get into the specific details of exactly what we were doing, partly because it still makes me deeply uncomfortable to think about, and partly because I genuinely believe some of that information is better left unshared, given everything that ended up happening as a direct result of it, not wanting to risk putting that same kind of specific, dangerous knowledge into anyone else's hands. At some point during that night, the atmosphere in the room shifted in a way that is genuinely difficult to put into words for anyone who was not actually there to feel it happen. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, colder, thicker somehow, in a way that had nothing to do with the actual temperature of the room, a pressure settling in that I can only describe as feeling almost physical, like the very air had gained weight. Several of us noticed it at roughly the same time, exchanging uneasy glances with each other without anyone quite wanting to be the first to say something out loud and risk sounding paranoid or overly dramatic in front of everyone else. That particular kind of shared silence, where everyone is thinking the same thing, but nobody wants to be the one who breaks the mood first. It was right around that same moment that I first noticed something genuinely wrong with the young man I mentioned earlier. His posture changed first, his shoulders squaring off in a way that looked stiff and unnatural, nothing like his usual relaxed, easygoing way of carrying himself. The change so sudden and so complete that it looked almost like watching someone else entirely step into his body and immediately adjust to a completely different frame. Then, his eyes changed. I do not know how else to describe it except to say that whatever was looking out from behind his eyes at that moment was clearly not him anymore, not in any recognizable sense. His pupils seemed to blow wide, swallowing up almost the entire visible portion of his eyes, and something about the specific quality of that darkness looked identical, chillingly identical, to the eyes of a dead body I had unfortunately had occasion to see up close at an earlier point in my life, a memory I had spent years trying not to think about too closely, now suddenly resurfacing in the worst possible context. That same flat, lightless, utterly vacant quality. The kind of look that makes your entire body understand, on some instinctive level, that whatever you are looking at is no longer occupied by the person it should be. Everyone else in the room seemed to notice the change happening at roughly the same time I did, conversation dying out almost instantly as all of our attention snapped toward him. He did not say anything at first. He simply stood there, completely rigid, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular. His breathing slow and deliberate in a way that felt deeply unnatural for someone his age and his usual level of energy. I made the mistake, in that moment, of stepping toward him, some instinct telling me I needed to check on him directly, to ask if he was okay, completely unprepared for what was about to happen the second I got close enough. The moment I was within arm's reach, he moved. I do not think I have ever seen another human being move that fast in my entire life, before or since, a speed that genuinely did not seem to match his usual physical build or coordination at all. 1 second he was standing there, rigid and unresponsive, and the next, His hands were around my throat, gripping with a strength that felt genuinely impossible for someone his actual size, and build to produce naturally. A strength that felt like it belonged to something far larger and far heavier than the person I had known him to be. I remember the specific crushing pressure of it immediately, my airway closing off almost instantly, my vision beginning to blur at the edges within what felt like only a few seconds. I want to be honest about how frightening that specific sensation actually was. The complete, sudden loss of control over something as basic and essential as breathing. My hands instinctively coming up to try to pry his fingers loose, my mind racing through pure animal panic rather than any kind of coherent thought, every ordinary concern I might otherwise have had in that moment completely overridden by the single, overwhelming need to simply get air back into my lungs. Everyone else in the room reacted almost immediately once they saw what was happening. Several people rushing forward to try to pull him off of me, shouting his name, shouting at him to stop, none of it seeming to register with him at all in that moment. He held on to me with a grip that felt completely immovable, his face utterly blank and expressionless the entire time. None of the usual signs of exertion or strain you would expect from someone genuinely fighting or struggling physically. No grimace, no gritted teeth, nothing at all beyond that same flat, empty stare fixed directly on me. I do not know exactly how long that entire struggle actually lasted, since time itself seemed to stretch and distort in a way that made it impossible to accurately judge in the moment. But it felt like an eternity, my lungs burning, my vision narrowing down to almost nothing, genuinely believing, in that specific moment, that I was actually going to die right there in that room, surrounded by people who were trying desperately to help me, but who could not seem to break his grip no matter how hard they pulled at him. Several of them shouting at each other now, trying to coordinate some way to actually pry his fingers loose without accidentally hurting either of us further in the process. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, everything changed again. His grip on my throat simply released, all at once, and he collapsed backward. Several of the other people in the room barely managing to catch him before he hit the ground, his whole body suddenly limp and unresponsive in their arms the same way it had been rigid and forceful only seconds earlier. I fell to my knees myself, gasping and coughing, my hands going instinctively to my own throat, my whole body shaking uncontrollably from the adrenaline and the sheer terror of what had just happened to me. Someone nearby immediately crouching down beside me, asking if I was okay, their voice sounding strangely distant and muffled through the ringing still in my ears. That was when his eyes changed again, this time back into something recognizably human, flooded suddenly with an expression of pure, overwhelming fear and confusion, the transformation almost as jarring to witness as the original change had been. He started screaming, an agonized, genuinely distressed sound unlike anything I had ever heard a person make before, his whole body convulsing slightly as he came back to himself fully. He was screaming directly at me, his face only a few feet from mine, asking over and over what had happened, what he had done, why everyone was looking at him the way they were, his voice cracking and breaking with every single word. It became immediately clear, from the sheer, genuine panic and confusion in his voice, that he had absolutely no memory whatsoever of what had just happened. No awareness at all that his own hands had just been wrapped around my throat only moments earlier, actively trying to choke the life out of me. He kept asking, over and over, what happened? What happened? Why is everyone looking at me like that? His voice cracking with genuine terror as he clearly began piecing together, from everyone else's reactions, that something deeply wrong had just occurred, something involving him directly, something he had absolutely no memory of participating in, his eyes darting frantically between each of our faces, looking for any kind of answer. I remember struggling to actually speak myself in that moment. my throat raw and aching from the pressure that had just been applied to it, managing only a hoarse, broken explanation that he had grabbed me, that he had tried to strangle me, that something had clearly taken control of him entirely for those several minutes, each word costing me real, physical effort to force out through my damaged throat. Watching the realization of that information actually land on him was almost as disturbing as the attack itself had been. Watching genuine horror and self-disgust wash over his face as he processed what he had apparently just done to someone he considered a friend, something he had absolutely no conscious memory of choosing to do himself, his whole expression collapsing in on itself as the weight of it truly sank in. The rest of that night is honestly something of a blur in my own memory. The adrenaline and the shock of everything that had just happened, making it difficult to recall every single detail with perfect clarity. Entire stretches of time feeling compressed or missing entirely when I try to reconstruct the sequence of events afterward. I remember someone eventually bringing me some water, my hands still shaking too badly to hold the glass steadily on my own, someone else having to hold it up to my lips for the first few sips. I remember the young man himself completely falling apart emotionally, sobbing uncontrollably, apologizing over and over, even though every single one of us in that room understood, on some level, that whatever had just happened was not something he had actually chosen to do himself. Several people trying to comfort him, even while still clearly shaken themselves by everything they had just witnessed. In the days and weeks that followed, we all tried in our own ways to make sense of what had actually happened that night, though none of us ever really arrived at anything resembling a satisfying, complete explanation, each of us privately turning the whole experience over in our heads without ever fully landing on anything that felt conclusive. The young man himself never fully recovered his usual sense of ease and confidence after that incident, carrying around a persistent, visible unease that had never been part of his personality before that night. Flinching at sudden noises, growing quieter in group settings, avoiding eye contact in a way that felt entirely unlike the person we had all known before. He eventually distanced himself from our group entirely, and I genuinely cannot blame him for that decision, given everything that had happened. Understanding completely why he would want to separate himself as far as possible from anything connected to that particular night and everyone who had witnessed it happened to him. I mentioned earlier that I actually managed to capture a portion of this entire encounter on video using my phone, which had been recording for an entirely unrelated reason earlier that same evening and simply happened to still be running when everything actually happened. Propped up somewhere in the room, forgotten about entirely once the situation escalated. I did eventually go back and watch that footage. Once, sometime after the initial shock of everything had settled down somewhat, sitting alone in my room late at night, hesitating for a long while with my thumb hovering over the play button before finally forcing myself to press it. I want to be honest and say that watching it back was one of the most disturbing experiences of my entire life. Seeing my own face on that recording, watching his hands wrap around my throat, watching his expression remain completely blank and vacant throughout the entire struggle, in a way that looked even more unnatural on video than it had felt in the moment itself. There was something about seeing it played back, removed slightly from the immediate adrenaline of actually living through it. That made the whole experience feel even more genuinely wrong, more clearly, undeniably abnormal than it had even felt while it was actually happening to me directly. My own recorded voice, barely audible, beneath the sound of my own choking and gasping. I ended up deleting that footage entirely, not long after watching it that single time, sitting there with my thumb over the delete button for what felt like a long time before finally committing to it. I could not bring myself to keep it stored anywhere, even privately, even just for my own records or my own peace of mind. Something about knowing that footage existed, sitting there on a device I used every single day, felt like carrying around a small, persistent threat. A reminder of something I genuinely wanted to distance myself from as completely as possible. An object I could not stop imagining opening again by accident during some ordinary moment scrolling through my phone. I have occasionally regretted that decision since, wondering whether having that footage might have helped convince other people of what I actually experienced. Given how difficult it has always been to get anyone to take this story seriously without visual proof to back it up. But mostly, I have never regretted it at all, relieved every single day that footage no longer exists anywhere for me to accidentally stumble across again. This was far from the only demonic encounter I experienced during that particular period of my life, though it remains, without question, the single most physically dangerous and directly threatening one I ever personally went through. I have witnessed shadow figures moving through rooms where no natural explanation could account for them. Tall, dark shapes gliding along walls in a way that no ordinary shadow cast by any light source in the room could ever have replicated. I have heard voices whispering things no living person in the room could have possibly said, sometimes in languages none of us recognized or understood, low, murmuring sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, impossible to trace back to any actual source. I have watched objects move on their own, without any physical explanation whatsoever. Small items sliding across tables or shelves as though pushed by an invisible hand, sometimes slowly and deliberately, other times suddenly flung across a room with a force that made no sense given how light the object itself actually was. But nothing, absolutely nothing, ever came close to matching the sheer, visceral terror of actually having someone else's hands around my own throat. Someone I trusted, someone I considered a genuine friend, his own body being used as a weapon against me by something that was clearly not him in any real, meaningful sense during those several minutes. I have thought about that specific detail more than almost anything else in the years since it actually happened. The fact that whatever took control of him that night specifically chose to use his own body, his own physical strength, to attempt to genuinely kill me, rather than manifesting as some kind of separate, visible entity the way so many of my other encounters had involved. A distinction that has always struck me as somehow even more violating than simply seeing a shadow or hearing a whispered voice from somewhere unseen. I have wondered, more than once, whether there was something specific about him that made him more vulnerable to that kind of possession than the rest of us in that room that night. Some particular openness or susceptibility that the rest of us simply did not share in the same way. I never got a clear answer to that question, and given how distant he eventually became from our entire group afterward, I never really had the opportunity to properly discuss it with him directly either, beyond that immediate chaotic aftermath on the actual night it happened. I think about his eyes constantly, even now, years removed from that entire experience. That specific, chilling similarity between what I saw looking out from behind his eyes during the possession and what I had witnessed looking into the eyes of an actual deceased person on a completely separate occasion in my life has never left me, resurfacing at the strangest, most unexpected moments even now, sometimes triggered by nothing more than a stranger's particular expression caught briefly in passing. There is something profoundly unsettling about recognizing that same specific quality of absence, of vacancy, in someone who is still very much alive and breathing right in front of you. Someone whose body is still moving, still functioning, but whose actual self has clearly, temporarily, been displaced entirely by something else occupying that same physical space, wearing his face and his body like a borrowed coat. I do not expect most people who hear this story to actually believe me. And honestly, at this point, I have mostly stopped expecting that kind of validation from anyone who was not actually there in that room with me that night. I understand completely why it sounds like the kind of exaggerated, embellished story someone might tell purely for shock value or attention, and I recognize that without that video footage, which I chose to delete, there is genuinely no way for me to offer any kind of concrete, verifiable proof to back up what I am telling you. All I can offer is my own genuine, unwavering certainty about what I personally witnessed and experienced firsthand that night. The specific, undeniable feeling of another person's hands closing around my own throat with a strength that made absolutely no physical sense given who he actually was under any ordinary circumstances. I have talked to a small handful of people over the years who were also present in that same room that same night, and every single one of them describes the same basic sequence of events with a consistency that has never wavered even once, no matter how much time has actually passed since it originally happened, or how many separate times any of us have since been asked to retell the whole thing. From start to finish, the same core details always lining up perfectly, no matter which one of us specifically happens to be the one telling it on any given occasion. None of us have ever fully agreed on exactly what caused it, whether it was something we had genuinely, if unknowingly, invited into that space through whatever we had been doing earlier that same evening, or whether it was something that had simply been present already, waiting for an opportunity to manifest itself through whichever one of us happened to be most vulnerable or receptive to it in. That particular moment, a question none of us have ever managed to answer to anyone's actual satisfaction. What I do know with absolute certainty is that I nearly died that night at the hands of someone who, under any ordinary circumstances, would never have dreamed of hurting me in any way whatsoever. And I know that whatever was controlling him during those several terrifying minutes was not him, not in any meaningful, recognizable sense, judging purely by the absolute horror and genuine confusion that flooded back into his own eyes the moment it finally, mercifully released its hold over him, an expression I have never once doubted the authenticity of, not for a single second in all the years since. I still think about him sometimes, wondering how he has managed to live with the knowledge of what his own body did that night, even though none of us who were actually there ever held him personally responsible for something he clearly had no conscious control over or memory of participating in. I hope, wherever he is now, that he has found some way to make peace with that entire experience, the same way I have slowly, gradually managed to make my own kind of uneasy peace with it over the years since it actually happened to both of us, even if neither of us will probably ever fully move past it entirely. I have thought long and hard in the years since about whether I would ever willingly put myself in a similar situation again, whether I would ever again engage in the kind of activities that apparently opened the door to whatever it was that took control of him that particular night. The answer, unequivocally, is no. Whatever curiosity or thrill-seeking impulse originally drew me and the rest of that group toward those kinds of practices in the first place has been completely and permanently extinguished by everything that happened that single night. I have never again participated in anything even remotely similar since, and I do not intend to ever again in the future. Regardless of how much time continues to pass, or how distant that specific memory eventually becomes, having learned, in the most terrifying way imaginable, exactly what kind of price that particular curiosity can actually demand. I want to close by saying, as directly and honestly and openly as I possibly can, that I understand completely if you do not believe a single word of what I have just told you here today. I understand how genuinely far-fetched it sounds, how much it resembles the kind of exaggerated campfire story people invent purely to entertain or unsettle an audience gathered around them for exactly that purpose. But I lived through it myself, directly, and I still carry the memory of those specific, crushing few minutes with me every single day since it actually happened. The exact sensation of losing air, losing control, genuinely believing I was about to die at the hands of someone I trusted completely, someone whose body had been temporarily, completely taken over by something that was absolutely, unmistakably not him. That night changed something in me permanently and completely, some fundamental sense of safety and trust that I do not think I will ever fully recover, even after all this considerable time that has passed since. I still occasionally wake up at night with that same specific phantom sensation of pressure closing in around my own throat. My body apparently still processing and reliving that experience even now, all these years later, regardless of how much conscious progress I feel like I have genuinely made in moving past it during my ordinary waking hours. I do not know if that particular reaction will ever fully go away completely on its own. And at this point, I have mostly made peace with the genuine possibility that it simply never will. That this is now simply a permanent, unavoidable part of who I am and what I carry with me every single day, whether I actually want to or not. A scar that never fully closed over, no matter how much time has been allowed to pass since the night it was first made. Even now, whenever I happen to catch sight of someone's eyes going strangely blank or distant for even a brief moment, whether in a photograph, a video, or just someone standing lost in thought somewhere in public, I feel that same old flicker of unease creeping back in. Some part of me instantly on alert, scanning for any further sign that something might not be entirely right. I know, logically, that the vast majority of those moments mean absolutely nothing at all. Just an ordinary person daydreaming or distracted for a second, but knowing that logically has never fully managed to override the instinct that particular night carved into me. An instinct I suspect I will simply be carrying around with me for the rest of my life, whether I like it or not. I have thought more than once over the years about whether writing all of this down and sharing it might actually help me process the whole experience a little more fully. The way people sometimes say putting a traumatic memory into words can help loosen its grip somewhat over time. I am honestly not sure it has. Not entirely, though there is a small, quiet relief in finally getting the whole account out clearly and completely, rather than carrying it around only half-formed in my own head the way I have for so many years now, replaying fragments of it privately, without ever putting the entire sequence together from start to finish for anyone else to actually hear it in full. Whatever that relief actually amounts to, I am grateful for it, even knowing that the underlying memory itself will almost certainly never fully leave me. No matter how many times I tell this story, or how many more years continue to pass since that single, unforgettable night that changed so much about how I move through the rest of my life. If there is one single thing I genuinely hope anyone reading this actually takes away from it, it is simply this. Be careful what you invite into a room, into a shared space, into a night that feels harmless and exciting in the moment. Whatever door we opened together that particular evening, none of us ever fully understood what we were actually risking until it was already far too late to take any of it back. And I would not wish that same specific, hard-learned lesson on anyone else, no matter how curious or how confident they might currently feel about their own safety in similar circumstances. I had a genuinely toxic girlfriend back in high school, and looking back on that entire relationship now, There were so many warning signs I simply did not know how to recognize at the time. Being young and completely inexperienced with relationships in general, having no real frame of reference for what a healthy dynamic between two people was even supposed to look like. She was the kind of person who would do absolutely anything for the sake of a thrill or entertainment, with the one exception being drugs, which she never touched. A boundary she seemed genuinely proud of maintaining, even while crossing nearly every other line imaginable. Beyond that boundary, though, there was very little else she would not do for the sake of pure entertainment. She would cheat on me without any hesitation whatsoever, and she would also deliberately position herself as the other woman in someone else's relationship on purpose, fully aware of exactly what she was doing every step of the way, and seemingly getting some kind of genuine enjoyment out of the sheer chaos and disruption it caused for absolutely everyone else involved. Anything for fun really was her personal motto in every single sense of that phrase, applied without exception to nearly every part of her life and every relationship she was ever involved in. She also always described herself as being into unusual, somewhat niche aesthetics, styles that were not particularly mainstream or widely known back during that specific period of time. Well before those same styles eventually became more common and more widely recognized online years later. She was genuinely obsessed with certain visual aesthetics that not many people around us were even aware of back then, and she would also sometimes lean heavily into a general witch aesthetic, dressing and decorating herself in a style clearly inspired by witchcraft imagery and iconography. I do not know for certain whether anything I eventually experienced with her was actually connected in any real way to these particular interests of hers, and I want to be completely upfront about that uncertainty from the very start of this whole account. This is purely speculation on my part, and I have no concrete proof tying the two things together beyond my own suspicions built up over time and countless hours spent turning the whole situation over in my head since it happened. Whenever I actually broke up with her, my entire life would turn into a genuine nightmare afterward. She would badmouth me constantly throughout our shared school environment, spreading rumors and generally making my day-to-day life as miserable as she possibly could manage, recruiting mutual friends to her side of the story before I even had a chance to explain my own perspective to anyone. This was a consistent pattern every single time our relationship ended, regardless of the specific reasons behind the breakup itself, almost as though the aftermath had become its own predictable ritual she went through every time. She was also a genuinely talented artist, someone with real, obvious skill, and over the course of our relationship, she had created several sketches of me, portrait-style drawings that I genuinely loved and appreciated at the time. Proud that someone with real artistic skill had chosen to capture my likeness in that way, showing them off to friends whenever I got the chance, genuinely flattered that she had put that much time and effort into something so specifically tied to me. But there was one specific incident involving these sketches that has stuck with me ever since. Something genuinely creepy that I have never fully been able to explain or shake off, no matter how many years have passed since it originally happened. This particular incident happened after we had broken up once again and then somehow gotten back together, which, looking back now, feels like it was consistently bad luck on my part every single time it happened. I mean, genuinely, terribly bad luck. The kind of pattern I should have recognized much sooner than I actually did. A cycle that repeated itself so many times over the course of our relationship that I honestly lost count somewhere along the way. During this particular stretch after getting back together, I noticed her trying to hide a piece of paper in between the pages of her sketchbook, tucking it away quickly the moment she noticed I was looking in her direction, her whole body language shifting instantly into something guarded and defensive. Naturally, I asked her directly what it was, telling her to show it to me. She immediately refused, saying no, never, in a tone that made it clear she had no intention of budging on the matter, no matter how much I pushed. Her voice suddenly sharp in a way that caught me off guard, given how relaxed our conversation had been only moments earlier. I remember feeling genuinely creeped out in that exact moment, wondering what on earth could possibly be so bad that she felt the need to hide it from me so aggressively, especially given how open she normally was about sharing her artwork with me throughout our entire relationship up to that point, practically showing me every single sketch she ever finished without a second thought. And then, quite suddenly, the piece of paper slipped out of her sketchbook entirely, falling loose and landing where I could clearly see it for myself, close enough that there was no possible way to mistake what I was actually looking at. It was one of my own portraits, one of the very sketches she had drawn of me that I had genuinely loved and cherished at the time. The same beautiful likeness I remembered clearly from when she had first shown it to me, back when things between us still felt relatively normal. Except now, in this altered version, my eyes in the portrait had been bulged out unnaturally, and worse than that, actually cut out entirely from the paper itself, leaving two ragged, empty holes where my eyes should have been depicted. The torn edges rough and uneven in a way that suggested it had been done with real force behind it, rather than any kind of careful, deliberate cutting. After seeing that, I was completely and thoroughly creeped out, and she never once offered me any kind of explanation for why she had done that to my portrait, no matter how directly or persistently I asked her about it afterward. No matter how many times I brought it back up over the following days, hoping she would finally crack and tell me the truth. I want to explain why I am making such a significant deal out of this particular detail, because I know it might sound like a strange thing to fixate on so heavily years later. These specific kinds of techniques genuinely exist within certain black magic and folk magic traditions, where people deliberately cut out the eyes from photographs or paintings of another person as a way of symbolically preventing that person from seeing certain things clearly, things that might otherwise be completely obvious to them under normal circumstances. And I did not fully see at the time just how badly she had actually been affecting me throughout our entire relationship, how much of my own perception and judgment had been clouded by everything she put me through during those years we spent together. It was genuinely awful, that entire period of my life, and I remember specifically thinking, during the worst stretches of our relationship, that nobody else could ever possibly love me the way she did, as though I were genuinely under some kind of spell that made it impossible for me to see the situation clearly or consider walking away for good, no matter how many opportunities to leave presented themselves along the way. Looking back on that entire experience now, with the benefit of considerable time and distance from it, I find myself turning that specific memory over constantly, trying to make sense of exactly what I actually witnessed that day and what it might have genuinely meant, if anything at all, beyond the obvious, disturbing artistic choice she had made in that moment. The idea that she might have deliberately altered that portrait as some kind of intentional act tied to actual black magic practices has never fully left my mind since that day, especially once I later learned more about the specific symbolic significance behind that exact kind of alteration. Cutting or obscuring the eyes in a depicted image specifically to prevent the depicted person from perceiving something clearly. I have thought a great deal about the timing of everything as well. The fact that this particular incident happened specifically after we had broken up and then gotten back together yet again, a pattern that had already repeated itself more times than I care to admit throughout our entire relationship, each cycle following an almost identical shape. The breakup, the misery, the eventual reconciliation. Every single time I actually worked up the courage and the clarity to end things with her my life would become genuinely miserable in the immediate aftermath, filled with rumors and social sabotage that made staying away from her feel considerably harder than it probably should have, wearing down whatever resolve I had managed to build up in the first place. And every single time, we somehow ended up back together again, regardless, despite everything I had already experienced, and despite every single warning sign I had already witnessed with my own eyes, as though some part of me simply could not maintain the distance no matter how badly I actually wanted to. I find myself wondering now, with the added context of everything I eventually learned about these specific black magic techniques, whether that repeated cycle of breaking up and getting back together was ever genuinely as coincidental or as purely emotional as I originally assumed it to be at the time, or whether something else entirely had actually been driving it the whole time, without my ever realizing it. Was it possible that she was actively doing something specific and deliberate every time we separated, some kind of ritual or practice specifically intended to draw me back to her against my own better judgment, against whatever clarity I might have otherwise managed to hold on to during those periods when we were actually apart from each other? I genuinely do not know the answer to that question with any certainty, and I doubt I ever fully will, but the specific detail of that defaced portrait, with my eyes so deliberately bulged and then cut completely out, has never stopped nagging at me as a piece of evidence pointing in that particular direction. I also think often about her broader fascination with these unusual aesthetics she was so drawn to during that period, wondering now whether that interest ever went beyond simply enjoying a particular visual style or subculture, whether it might have actually reflected some genuine, deeper engagement with actual occult practices and belief systems that I never fully understood or took seriously at the time. Looking back, I recognize that I was genuinely naive about a lot of things during that stretch of my life, dismissing plenty of details as simply quirky personality traits or aesthetic preferences, rather than considering that they might have actually meant something considerably more significant underneath the surface. Details I brushed past far too quickly, without ever stopping to ask myself why they mattered so much to her in the first place. The witch aesthetic she also gravitated toward heavily at certain points feels considerably more obviously connected to actual occult interest in hindsight, especially when I combine it with everything else I eventually pieced together about that entire relationship. At the time, I simply saw it as one more example of her broader interest in unusual alternative styles, nothing that struck me as particularly alarming or worth digging into any further, just another facet of her personality I accepted without question, the same way I accepted everything else about her. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and everything else I have learned since, I find myself wondering whether I was simply too inexperienced and too emotionally entangled with her at the time to properly recognize what might have actually been happening right in front of me the entire time, hiding in plain sight behind interests I had always assumed were purely aesthetic. I have talked about that specific experience with a small handful of close people over the years since it happened. Mostly close friends who knew both of us personally back during that period of my life, sharing the story only occasionally and usually only when the general subject of past relationships came up naturally in conversation. Their reactions have varied quite a bit depending on how seriously they take the idea of actual black magic or occult practices being genuinely real and effective in the first place. Some of them have been quick to suggest a more mundane explanation, that she simply had some kind of intense emotional reaction in the moment and defaced the portrait purely out of anger or frustration during some private moment I was never actually present to witness myself, without any deeper occult significance attached to the act at all. I understand why that explanation feels more comfortable and more immediately believable to people hearing the story secondhand, And I do not necessarily disagree that it remains a genuinely plausible possibility, one I have considered seriously myself more than once over the years. But others, particularly those who know a bit more about actual folk magic traditions and their specific practices, have reacted with immediate, genuine concern the moment I described that particular detail of the cutout eyes, recognizing right away the specific symbolic weight that kind of alteration can carry within certain magical traditions, sometimes going quiet for a moment before asking me to repeat the detail again just to be sure they had heard it correctly. Hearing that reaction confirmed for me that I was not simply overreacting or reading too much into an otherwise ordinary, if disturbing, act of vandalism against her own artwork. I never did get any kind of real closure or explanation from her directly about that specific incident, since our relationship eventually ended for good not too long afterward, and we have not spoken or had any real contact with each other since that final breakup, our paths simply diverging entirely once high school itself finally ended. I do not know whether she ever created anything similar involving other people she dated after me, whether that particular defaced portrait was a one-time isolated incident specifically tied to our relationship, or whether it represented some kind of ongoing practice she engaged in repeatedly throughout her life with various different partners over the years. I have no way of actually knowing the answer to that question, and at this point I have mostly made peace with never finding out for certain, though the curiosity does still resurface every so often, usually late at night when this whole memory happens to come back to me unprompted. What I do know, without any doubt whatsoever, is how genuinely difficult it was for me to actually break away from that relationship for good. How convinced I remained throughout so much of that toxic dynamic that nobody else could ever possibly love me the way she claimed to. An absolute certainty that, looking back now, with considerably more perspective and emotional distance, feels less like a genuine, organic feeling and more like something that had been deliberately, carefully cultivated and reinforced in me over an extended period of time, whether through purely psychological manipulation, some kind of actual occult influence, or, quite possibly, some combination of both working together simultaneously, feeding off each other in ways I never once suspected while I was still actually inside that relationship myself. I eventually did manage to break completely free of that relationship and that entire toxic dynamic for good, though it took considerably longer than it probably should have, and it took a genuine, concerted effort on my part to actually recognize and dismantle the specific belief that I could never find love or genuine connection with anyone else beyond her. A belief that had settled so deeply into how I thought about myself that unlearning it felt almost like relearning how to think entirely. Looking back now, I recognize that belief for exactly what it actually was: a deeply unhealthy, deliberately reinforced narrative that served her own interests far more than it ever reflected any kind of objective, honest truth about my own worth or my own genuine romantic prospects moving forward in life. The image of that defaced portrait, with my own eyes bulged and then completely cut out of the paper, has never fully left my memory, resurfacing every so often even now, years removed from that entire relationship and everything that happened during it, usually arriving completely unprompted at the strangest, most unrelated moments of an otherwise ordinary day. I do not know for certain whether it was genuinely connected to any real occult practice or black magic ritual, and I recognize that I will likely never have any way of confirming that suspicion definitively, one way or the other. But the timing of it, combined with everything else I already knew about her broader interests, and everything I eventually learned about the specific symbolic meaning behind that particular kind of alteration, has never let me fully dismiss the possibility that something considerably more deliberate and considerably more disturbing was actually happening behind the scenes throughout our entire relationship. Something I was simply too young, too inexperienced, and too emotionally entangled with her during that specific time in my life to properly recognize or understand while I was still actually living through it myself. My grandfather passed away last year, sometime when my son was still only about a year old. Right in that stage of life where every single day seems to bring some new small milestone, a new word, a new step, a new little personality trait starting to show through. Losing my grandfather during that particular window of my son's life has always felt strange to me in a way I find hard to fully explain, because it meant my son was old enough to have real memories forming, but young enough that I could never be completely sure what he actually understood, and what simply passed through him the way most things do at that age, half noticed and quickly forgotten. What happened a few nights after the funeral changed that uncertainty into something I still cannot fully explain, something that has stayed with me every single day since. My grandfather was, in many ways, exactly the kind of man people picture when they think of a stereotypical, stern old grandfather. He was quiet by nature, not unkind, but reserved. The sort of man who did not waste words and preferred to let his presence speak for itself rather than filling a room with conversation. He had worked hard his entire life, first in a factory job that he held for over 3 decades, and later in a small business he built up slowly after retiring from that factory work, refusing to simply sit still even once he technically did not need to work anymore. He carried himself with a quiet kind of pride, always dressed neatly even for casual family dinners, always sitting a little straighter than everyone else at the table. The kind of man whose approval you found yourself quietly seeking even into adulthood, simply because he gave it so rarely and so carefully. Despite that outward seriousness, or maybe because of it, there was a softer side to him that only really came out around small children, and even then, only when he thought no one else was paying close attention. My cousins used to tell stories about this same behavior when they were young, how grandfather would seem completely serious and unbothered during a family gathering, sitting quietly in his usual chair, seemingly uninterested in the noise and chaos of small children running around him, until he thought the adults in the room were distracted with their own conversations. Then, and only then, he would lean over toward whichever small child happened to be nearby and make the silliest, most exaggerated face you could imagine, crossing his eyes, puffing out his cheeks, sometimes even sticking out his tongue like a cartoon character, just for a second or two, just long enough to get a delighted burst of laughter out of whatever child he had chosen as his private audience that day. If you tried to catch him doing it, if you looked over quickly hoping to see it happen, his face would already be back to its usual calm, composed expression, as though nothing at all had happened, leaving you wondering for a moment if you had imagined the whole thing. It became something of a family joke over the years, the way grandfather would insist, with a completely straight face, that he had no idea what anyone was talking about whenever someone mentioned it, even as the child he had just entertained sat there giggling uncontrollably right next to him. My mother always said he had been exactly the same way with her and her siblings when they were small, decades earlier, this same quiet man who could apparently only truly let himself be playful when he believed no other adult eyes were on him. By the time my son came along, grandfather was already quite a bit older, slower in his movements, more careful getting in and out of chairs, needing a bit more help than he used to. But that same quiet, mischievous streak never really left him, and if anything, it seemed to soften and deepen with age rather than fade away. Our whole extended family had a standing tradition of gathering together for dinner every single Friday night, something that had been going on for as long as I could remember. Originally at my grandparents' house, when my grandmother was still alive, and later, after she passed years earlier, continuing on in the same house with grandfather still hosting, even well into his 80s, refusing every suggestion that maybe someone else should take over hosting duties to make things easier on him. My son, being the newest and smallest member of the family by that point, quickly became a regular target for grandfather's private little performances. I noticed it myself on more than one occasion, catching just the tail end of some silly face grandfather had made toward my son's high chair, quickly smoothing his expression back into its usual calm by the time I glanced over. Though the giveaway was always my son's sudden burst of baby laughter, the kind of full-body toddler giggle that comes out of nowhere and makes everyone else at the table smile along without even knowing what caused it. Grandfather would sit there afterward looking perfectly innocent, occasionally allowing himself the smallest hint of a satisfied smile if he thought I was not looking closely enough to notice. Because of this pattern repeating itself nearly every single Friday for the better part of a year, my son came to genuinely know and recognize his great-grandfather. In whatever limited but real way a child that young comes to know the important people in his small world. He would light up a little whenever we arrived at the house on Friday evenings, reaching his arms out toward grandfather's chair even before we had properly gotten him out of his coat, already anticipating, in his own toddler way, that something fun was probably about to happen once the adults around the table got distracted enough with their own conversations. Grandfather passed away fairly suddenly, without a long illness or extended warning beforehand, the kind of loss that leaves an entire family scrambling somewhat to process what happened, even as they are also trying to organize a funeral and handle all the practical matters that come with losing someone so central to weekly family life. The funeral itself was a fairly large affair, given how many years grandfather had spent in the same community, given how many people, family and otherwise, had come to know and quietly respect him over the decades. My son was there too young to understand what any of it really meant, mostly occupied during the service with a small toy car someone had brought along to keep him quiet, occasionally looking up curiously at the unusually large crowd of solemn-faced adults surrounding him. The days immediately following the funeral passed in that strange, foggy way that grief tends to create, full of visiting relatives, casseroles left on the doorstep by well-meaning neighbors, and long, quiet stretches where nobody quite knew what to say to fill the silence grandfather's absence had suddenly created in our usual routines. Friday night dinners, for the first time in longer than I could remember, simply did not happen that week, nobody having the heart yet to gather in that same house without him sitting in his usual chair at the head of the table. It was a couple of nights after the funeral, in the middle of one of those quiet, unsettled nights that seem to come along during periods of grief, when the strange part of this story happened. My son, at that age, had developed a fairly common toddler habit of climbing into bed with my wife and me sometime in the middle of the night, usually somewhere between 1 and 3 in the morning, padding quietly down the hallway from his own room and simply climbing up onto our bed without much explanation, needing that closeness in a way toddlers often do, regardless of whether anything is actually wrong. We had mostly gotten used to this by then, half waking up just enough to shift over and make room for him before drifting back to sleep with him tucked between us. On this particular night, at around 2 in the morning, I woke up not to the usual quiet shuffling of small feet crossing the hallway, but instead to the sound of my son laughing. Not a small, sleepy giggle, but genuine, full, uncontrollable laughter. The kind of deep belly laugh that usually only happens during broad daylight, in the middle of some ridiculous game with an adult who is actively trying to entertain him. Hearing that sound coming from somewhere outside our bedroom, in the middle of the night, in an otherwise completely silent house, immediately pulled me fully awake in a way few things managed to do so quickly. I sat up, listening for a moment, half expecting the laughter to simply stop as suddenly as it had started, assuming maybe he was having some kind of vivid dream that had spilled over briefly into waking laughter before he settled back down. But it did not stop. It continued, steady and clearly awake sounding, coming from somewhere further away than his own bedroom, somewhere down the hallway, out toward the living room area of our house. My wife stirred slightly beside me, murmuring something about checking on him, but something in me was already moving, getting out of bed and heading toward the sound before I had fully decided to do so. I walked down the short hallway from our bedroom, my bare feet quiet against the hardwood floor, following the sound of that continuing laughter, which grew slightly clearer the closer I got to the living room. When I reached the doorway and looked in, I found my son sitting in the middle of the living room floor in almost complete darkness, except for the faint glow of a streetlight coming through the front window, laughing steadily at something I could not immediately identify, his small face turned slightly upward, the way a child looks up at an adult standing over them. I stood there for a moment in the doorway, my own heart beating a little faster than it should have for what was, on the surface, a fairly ordinary sight of a toddler sitting up in the middle of the night. But something about the scene felt wrong in a way I could not immediately name. Some instinct picking up on details my conscious mind had not fully processed yet. The empty room around him, the direction his laughter and his gaze seemed to be aimed toward, a spot of empty air near where our armchair sat in the corner of the room. I finally spoke, my voice sounding a little too loud in the quiet of the house, asking him what he was doing up, calling him by name, trying to keep my tone light and normal even as something uneasy was starting to settle in my chest. He turned his head toward me at the sound of my voice, still smiling that wide, delighted toddler smile. And in his simple toddler speak, still mostly single words strung together rather than full sentences at that age, he said, quite clearly and happily, "Papa funny," gesturing with one small hand back toward that same empty corner of the room he had been looking at a moment before. I felt something cold move through me hearing those two words. Standing there in the dim, quiet living room at 2 a.m. Papa was what my son had always called my grandfather, following the lead of the rest of the family, everyone referring to him that way in front of the youngest generation rather than using the more formal title. Hearing my son say those words, gesturing happily toward an empty corner of our living room, just days after we had buried the man those words referred to, made every hair on my arms stand up at once. I told myself, standing there, that this could easily be explained away. Toddlers that age often have imaginary friends or half-formed memories that surface strangely, or simply enjoy repeating familiar phrases regardless of whether they fully understand the context behind them. I told myself grief was probably making me read far too much into an ordinary, if slightly unusual, toddler moment. But knowing all of that intellectually did very little to calm the uneasy feeling sitting heavily in my chest as I crossed the room and knelt down beside him. I asked him again, gently this time, what he was doing, who he was talking about, trying to get a slightly clearer answer out of him, even though I knew, realistically, that a child that age was unlikely to give me anything more detailed than what he had already offered. He simply repeated himself, "Papa funny," still smiling, still occasionally glancing back over toward that same empty corner of the room, as though something there continued to hold his attention, even as I knelt beside him, trying to get his focus onto me instead. After a moment, feeling increasingly unsettled by the whole scene, I decided the best thing to do was simply scoop him up and bring him back to bed with us for the rest of the night, telling myself firmly that whatever this was, A strange dream, an overactive toddler imagination, or something else I was not prepared to fully consider at 2 in the morning, it did not need to continue playing out in our dark living room. I picked him up, settling him against my hip the way I had done countless times before, and turned to carry him back down the hallway toward our bedroom. It was as I was carrying him away, his small head resting against my shoulder, that he lifted his head slightly, looked back over my shoulder toward that same empty corner of the living room we were leaving behind, and said, quite clearly and cheerfully, "Bye, Papa," followed immediately by blowing a small kiss with his little hand toward that same spot of empty air, exactly the way we had taught him to do whenever he said goodbye to someone he loved. I did not stop walking. I did not turn around to look at whatever spot in that room he was directing his small goodbye toward. I simply kept moving down the hallway, my grip on him tightening slightly without me fully deciding to do so, my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the small amount of physical effort it took to carry a 1-year-old down a short hallway. I brought him into our room, settled him into bed between my wife and me, and lay there wide awake for a long time afterward, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing slowly even out as he drifted back to sleep, apparently completely unbothered by whatever had just happened, while I remained far too awake to follow him into sleep myself for a long while after. I never told my son about that night, obviously, given how young he was at the time, and to this day, now that he is old enough to talk in full sentences and ask endless questions about everything around him, he has no memory of it at all, the way most of us have no real memories from that early in our lives. I have told a few people in my family about it since, quietly, usually only bringing it up late at night in similarly hushed, careful conversations, and the reactions have varied. Some dismiss it fairly easily, offering the same practical explanations I originally offered myself: toddler imagination, half-remembered phrases. Coincidence dressed up as something more meaningful, by grieving adults looking for a sign. Others, especially those who knew grandfather well and remembered his own quiet habit of making silly faces at small children when he thought no one else was watching, have gone quiet themselves upon hearing the story, their expressions shifting in a way that suggests they are not quite as ready to dismiss it as simple coincidence. I still do not know exactly what to make of that night myself, even now, more than a year later. I am not someone who spent much time before that thinking seriously about ghosts or spirits, or whether anything meaningfully continues on after a person dies. I have not become someone who believes firmly in any of that now either, not in any simple or complete way. But I also cannot fully explain away what I saw and heard that night in our dark living room, my son laughing at something in an empty corner, calling it Papa, saying goodbye to it with the exact same small wave and blown kiss we had taught him to give to real people he loved, aimed at a spot where, as far as I could see with my own eyes, there was absolutely nothing there at all. What I keep coming back to, whenever I think about that night, is not really fear, though there was certainly plenty of that in the moment itself, kneeling on that dark living room floor at 2 in the morning. What I keep coming back to instead is a strange, complicated kind of comfort, sitting right alongside the fear, the thought that maybe, in whatever way makes sense for someone in the earliest days after death, Grandfather had found his way back one last time to do the one small, private, silly thing he always seemed to enjoy most in his final years, making his youngest great-grandson laugh late at night, unseen by any of the adults in the house, exactly the way he always preferred to do it while he was still alive. If that really was him, standing quietly in the corner of our living room that night, then in some strange way I have made a kind of peace with it, even though it still gives me a small chill every single time I let myself think back to it too closely. especially late at night, especially when the house around me happens to be quiet enough for me to remember, all over again, exactly how it sounded. A few weeks ago, something happened to me and my girlfriend that I still cannot fully explain, no matter how many times I turn it over in my mind, trying to find some ordinary, comfortable explanation for it. We had been together for a little over 2 years at that point, living together for almost a year, sharing the same bedroom, the same bed, the same nightly routines that couples settle into once they have been living together long enough for it all to feel completely normal and unremarkable. Nothing about that particular night, at least at first, gave any indication that it would turn into something we would still be talking about weeks later, still unable to fully shake off. My girlfriend has always been someone who talks in her sleep, something I had gotten used to fairly early on in our relationship. Most of the time, it was nothing dramatic, just soft mumbling, half-formed sentences that made no real sense. Occasional laughter at some private dream joke, or sometimes just a quiet string of words with no clear connection to anything. The kind of sleep-talking most people who share a bed with a talkative sleeper eventually learn to tune out and sleep through without much disruption. I had grown so used to it, in fact, that most nights it barely registered anymore. My brain filtering it out the same way it filtered out the hum of the refrigerator down the hall or the occasional creak of the house settling. On this particular night, we had gone to bed at a fairly normal hour. Nothing unusual about our evening beforehand. No scary movies, no late-night conversations about anything remotely unsettling. Nothing that would explain what happened later beyond simple coincidence. We fell asleep the way we usually did, and for a while, the night passed exactly like any other. Quiet and uneventful. The kind of sleep neither of us would have remembered anything specific about if not for what happened next. I woke up suddenly, pulled out of a deep sleep by the sound of her voice, clear and sharp in the darkness of our bedroom. She said, quite distinctly, "What are you doing?" Her tone carrying a kind of urgency and alertness that immediately struck me as different from her usual sleep-talking. Normally, when she talked in her sleep, the words came out soft, slurred, disconnected from any clear emotion, more like background noise than anything that demanded a response. This was different. This sounded like someone who was fully awake, speaking directly to someone else in the room, her voice tight with a kind of confused alarm that cut straight through the fog of my own sleep and had me sitting up almost before I had fully processed what I had heard. I turned toward her in the darkness, my eyes still adjusting, and asked her what she meant, what she was talking about, half expecting her to still be asleep, to mumble something incoherent in response the way she usually did when I occasionally responded to her sleep, talking just to see what she would say. But this time, she actually woke up at the sound of my voice, blinking in the darkness, looking a little disoriented the way anyone does when they surface suddenly from a deep sleep into confused wakefulness. I asked her again what she had meant, what she had been dreaming about, my own heart still beating a little faster than normal from being woken so abruptly. She sat up slightly, rubbing her eyes, and told me she had seen someone standing at the end of our bed. She described it as feeling incredibly real in the moment, not like a typical hazy dream image that fades the second you try to focus on it, but something solid and present. A figure simply standing there at the foot of the bed, watching, close enough and clear enough that she had spoken directly to it before fully waking up, asking it, "What are you doing?" the same way you might ask a strange, unwelcome visitor in your own bedroom. She said she could not describe many specific details about the figure, no clear face, no distinguishing features she could put into words, just an overwhelming sense of a person-shaped presence standing there in the dark at the end of the bed, watching us both. Neither of us felt particularly frightened in that moment, at least not seriously so. We talked about it briefly in the way you do about strange dreams, sometimes with a nervous kind of laugh, chalking it up to nothing more than an especially vivid dream, or maybe some kind of sleep paralysis episode, something she had experienced once or twice before in the past, usually involving a similar feeling of a presence in the room paired with an inability to move properly while it was happening. We agreed it was strange, a little unsettling in the moment, but ultimately harmless, the kind of story you might bring up later as an interesting anecdote rather than something to genuinely worry about. After a few minutes of talking it through, both of us settled back down, pulled the blankets back up, and went back to sleep without much further thought about it. Secure enough in the ordinary explanation we had settled on together. I do not know exactly how much time passed after that, though based on how the rest of the night unfolded, it must have been somewhere around an hour later, judging by how deeply asleep I felt when I woke again the second time. This time, there was no sound to pull me out of sleep, no voice speaking in the darkness beside me. Instead, I simply woke up on my own, the way you sometimes do in the middle of the night for no clear reason at all, surfacing briefly from sleep before usually just rolling over and drifting straight back under. But this time, as my eyes opened in the darkness of our bedroom, I saw something standing at the end of our bed, not lying down, not sitting, but standing upright, directly on the mattress itself, at the foot of the bed where our feet usually rested during the night. The figure was wrapped, almost cocooned, in what looked like our bedsheets, the fabric twisted tightly around the shape of a body from somewhere around the waist all the way up to the neck, leaving only a vague, indistinct shape visible above where the sheets ended, no clear face that I could make out in the darkness, just a suggestion of a head sitting atop that tightly wrapped shape. I remember lying there for a moment, still mostly caught between sleep and waking, staring at this shape standing on our bed in the darkness, my mind struggling to process what I was actually looking at. Some small, still logical part of my brain was trying to offer up ordinary explanations, a trick of shadow and half-asleep eyes, some pile of blankets or clothing that had simply been left in an odd shape near the end of the bed. Anything that would make sense of what I was seeing, without requiring anything stranger than simple misperception in the dark. But even as I tried to reason my way into that comfortable explanation, some deeper, older part of my brain was already reacting on a level below conscious thought. The same kind of instinctive fear response you might feel encountering something dangerous in the wild long before your rational mind has finished analyzing exactly what the danger actually is. Without really deciding to, without consciously choosing my words, I heard myself speak into the darkness of our bedroom, my own voice sounding strange and far away to my own ears, asking, "What are you doing?" The exact same 4 words my girlfriend had spoken roughly an hour earlier about the exact same kind of figure, standing in the exact same spot at the end of our bed. The next thing I clearly remember is my girlfriend's hand on my shoulder, shaking me gently but urgently, her voice cutting through what I only then realized had actually been a dream, pulling me the rest of the way awake into the real darkness of our actual bedroom. The bed itself now completely empty at the foot end. No figure, no twisted sheets standing upright. Nothing at all beyond the ordinary shapes of our blankets, lying flat and undisturbed exactly where they should have been. She told me I had been talking in my sleep, that I had said something that had woken her up. And when I asked her, my heart still pounding, exactly what I had said, she repeated it back to me. "What are you doing?" The same 4 words, spoken in what she described as an unusually clear, alert voice. very different from my own occasional mumbled sleep-talking that she had grown used to over our time living together. We lay there together in the darkness after that, both of us now fully awake, comparing notes on what we had each separately experienced that night. And the more we talked it through, the more unsettled we both became. She had dreamed of a figure standing at the end of our bed, waking herself up by speaking directly to it. I had then, roughly an hour later, apparently dreamed the same basic scenario myself, a figure standing at the end of the same bed, though with the added detail of the sheets wrapped tightly around its body up to the neck, and had spoken the exact same 4 words she had spoken earlier, without any memory of having heard her say them the first time, in a way that could have simply lodged in my subconscious and resurfaced in my own dream. We turned the bedroom light on after that, both feeling too unsettled to simply lie back down in the dark and try to fall asleep again, right away. Neither of us saw anything unusual once the lights were on, no strange shapes, nothing out of place, our bedroom looking completely normal and undisturbed in every way, except for the shared, uneasy feeling sitting heavily between us. We ended up talking for a while longer, trying to make sense of what had happened, offering each other various possible explanations, most of which felt reasonable enough on the surface, but none of which fully satisfied the strange, coincidental precision of what we had each separately dreamed and said out loud within the same hour, in the same room, involving the exact same figure standing in the exact same place. One explanation we considered was simply that I had, on some level, been aware of her waking up and speaking those words the first time, even if I did not consciously register or remember it, my sleeping mind absorbing just enough of that moment to recreate a similar scenario in my own dream later that same night. This is certainly possible and probably the most rational explanation available to us, the kind of thing that happens more often than people realize. Information absorbed during light or interrupted sleep resurfacing later in dream form, without any clear conscious memory of the original moment. But even accepting that explanation intellectually did very little to actually ease the unsettled feeling both of us carried with us for the rest of that night. And honestly, for several nights afterward as well. For about a week or so following that night, neither of us slept especially well in that bedroom. We found ourselves leaving a small lamp on in the corner of the room, something neither of us had ever felt the need to do before, both of us a little too aware, whenever we woke briefly during the night for any reason, of the empty space at the foot of our bed, half expecting, in that groggy space between sleep and full wakefulness, to see something standing there again, wrapped in twisted sheets, silently watching us the way that figure had seemed to be doing in both of our dreams that same strange night. Nothing else happened after that first night. At least nothing as clear or dramatic as what we had both experienced within that single hour. No further shared dreams, no more strange sleep talking beyond her usual occasional mumbling. No more figures standing at the end of the bed in the middle of the night. Slowly, over the following weeks, the sharp edge of unease from that night began to soften into something more like an odd, slightly uncomfortable memory. The kind of story we now bring up occasionally, usually late at night when the conversation turns toward strange or unexplained experiences, always followed by the same slightly nervous laughter and the same unanswered question of what exactly happened that night, and why it happened to both of us, separately, within the same short window of time, involving the exact same figure and the exact same 4 words. I have thought about it a lot since then, turning it over in my mind during quiet moments, trying to find some explanation that fully satisfies the strangeness of it. Shared dreams, or at least dreams that overlap closely enough in content and timing to feel meaningfully connected, are something people have reported for a very long time, long before modern psychology tried to offer explanations involving shared environmental cues, absorbed sounds, or simple statistical coincidence, given how many dreams any two people sharing a bed regularly might have over the course of a year. Maybe that is all this really was, an unusually striking coincidence, made more memorable and unsettling simply because of how precisely the details lined up between what she experienced and what I experienced, roughly an hour apart in the very same bed. But there is a small, quiet part of me that has never fully settled on that explanation. A part of me that still, every so often, glances toward the foot of our bed in the last few seconds before falling asleep, half expecting, even now, weeks later, to see some shape standing there in the darkness, waiting to ask the same question we apparently both asked it that night, wrapped in twisted sheets, silent and still, watching us sleep in a bedroom that had never given either of us any reason to feel uneasy before that particular night, and has never quite felt as completely safe and ordinary since. When I was in 8th grade, my school organized a trip that everyone simply referred to as the Louisiana Tour, a multi-day trip that took our entire grade around to various historically significant sites across the southern part of the state. It was the kind of trip most of us had been looking forward to for months, less because we were especially interested in the history lessons waiting for us, and more because it meant several days away from regular classes, riding on buses with our friends, staying in unfamiliar hotels, and generally treating the whole thing as a mix of educational obligation and genuine adventure. Looking back now, it remains one of the more memorable school trips of my entire childhood, though not necessarily for the reasons the teachers who organized it originally intended. Among the various stops planned for that trip, one of the most anticipated, at least among students who had already heard rumors about it before we even left, was a visit to Myrtle's plantation, a large historic estate widely known and frequently discussed as one of the most haunted locations in the entire country. Even before arriving, several kids on the bus were already trading half-remembered stories they had picked up from older siblings or from television shows about haunted locations. Stories about murders, ghostly apparitions, and strange, unexplained happenings that supposedly occurred regularly on the property. Whether any of us fully believed those stories at the time is hard to say, but there was definitely a buzz of nervous excitement running through our group as the bus pulled up the long driveway toward the old plantation house. The house itself looked exactly like the kind of place such stories tend to grow up around. An old, elegant southern mansion with wide porches wrapping around much of the building, tall columns, and a slightly worn, aged quality to it that made it easy to imagine generations of history having played out within its walls. Our group was fairly large. An entire grade's worth of students, along with several chaperoning teachers, split into smaller groups for the actual guided tour through the interior of the house, since the rooms themselves were not large enough to comfortably hold everyone at once. My particular group ended up being a mix of my closer friends, along with several other students I knew more casually, plus a small handful of adults who were not part of our school group at all. Apparently, members of the public who had signed up for the same tour slot as us, since the plantation offered regular public tours in addition to accommodating school groups like ours. This meant our tour group that day included a few families we did not know personally, standing quietly among us as the guide led everyone from room to room, sharing the history and various reportedly supernatural stories associated with each space along the way. At one particular point during the tour, our group was standing together inside one of the larger rooms on the ground floor, the guide positioned near the front, speaking about some aspect of the house's history that I honestly cannot fully recall anymore, the specific details of that part of the tour having faded from my memory over the years in a way the rest of what happened that day certainly has not. As I stood there among my friends, only half paying attention to whatever the guide was explaining at that particular moment, I began to notice a strange sound layered quietly beneath the guide's voice and the general shuffling noise of a room full of people standing and listening. It sounded unmistakably like a single piano key being struck, a short, clear musical note ringing out briefly before fading away. The kind of sound you would expect from someone gently pressing down on one key of a piano rather than playing any kind of actual tune. At first, I assumed there must simply be a piano somewhere nearby, perhaps in an adjoining room, with someone, maybe another visitor or a member of the plantation staff, idly pressing a key while waiting for something else to happen. I glanced around the room we were standing in, looking for a piano that might explain the sound, but there was no piano anywhere visible in that particular room, nothing that could obviously account for what I was hearing. The sound came again a short time later, that same single clear note ringing out briefly amid the ambient noise of the tour group and the guide's continuing narration. This time, more curious and slightly puzzled than before, I began actively looking around the room more carefully, scanning the walls and corners, wondering if perhaps there was a piano in some adjoining space with the door open just enough to let the sound carry through, or some other mundane explanation I simply had not spotted yet. I still could not find anything that explained it. After hearing it a third time, I turned quietly to a couple of my friends standing close beside me and asked, in a low voice so as not to interrupt the guide, whether they had heard that piano sound too. They both looked at me a little blankly and said no, they had not heard anything unusual, just the guide talking and the usual background noise of a group of people standing together in an old house. I remember feeling a small flicker of doubt at that point, wondering if I had somehow misheard some other ordinary sound and simply convinced myself it resembled a piano note. Though something about the clarity and consistency of the sound each time made that explanation feel unsatisfying, even to me in the moment. Sure enough, only a short while later, I heard it again. That same clear single piano note, and this time I said out loud, a little more insistently, "There it is again. You must have heard that one." Certain that this time the sound had been clear and obvious enough that my friends standing right beside me could not possibly have missed it. But they simply gave me confused looks, clearly thinking I was either imagining things or perhaps trying to start some kind of joke at their expense, neither of which was actually the case, though I could understand why it might have looked that way from their perspective. Feeling a bit embarrassed and increasingly unsure of myself, I went back to quietly scanning the room, half listening for the guide's continuing explanation, and half still trying to spot some explanation for the sound I kept hearing that apparently nobody standing directly around me could hear at all. It was during this continued scanning of the room that I noticed something interesting happening among the wider tour group standing further away from my immediate circle of friends. Almost everyone in the room had their attention focused on the guide at the front, the way you would expect during a guided tour, listening attentively to whatever historical details were being shared. But one woman, standing with what appeared to be her husband and a son who looked to be roughly my own age, was not looking at the guide at all in that particular moment. Instead, her eyes were focused directly on me, an odd, questioning expression on her face. When our eyes met across the room, she raised one hand slightly and pointed first at me. Then at her own ear, her eyebrows raised in a clear, unspoken question, silently asking if I had heard something, the exact gesture immediately making it obvious to me that she was asking about the same strange sound I had been hearing and failing to explain to my own friends standing right beside me. I nodded back at her, a small, immediate confirmation, feeling an odd wave of relief wash over me at finally finding someone else in that crowded room who seemed to be experiencing the exact same thing I was, even though we were standing on opposite sides of the room and had never spoken to each other before that silent exchange. Almost as if the moment had been perfectly timed, though I am sure it was simply coincidence, the tour guide began describing, only shortly after that silent exchange between me and the woman across the room, a specific story connected to that particular part of the house. According to the guide, a soldier had died within the plantation at some point in its long history, and this soldier had apparently been known, while alive, for playing the piano regularly within the house. The guide went on to explain that over the years, numerous overnight guests staying at the plantation, since parts of it operated as a bed and breakfast in addition to offering historical tours, had reported hearing the faint sound of piano music, sometimes just a single note or two, playing somewhere within the house during the quiet hours of the night, with no explanation ever found for the source of the sound. Standing there, listening to the guide share that particular story, immediately after having spent the previous several minutes hearing exactly that kind of isolated single piano note myself, sent a genuinely uncomfortable chill through me, the kind of sensation that settles into your stomach and stays there for a while afterward. Even as the tour continued moving forward into other rooms and other stories, I did not know quite what to think in that moment. Caught somewhere between simple rational explanations, an old house with strange acoustics, some ordinary sound I had simply misidentified as resembling a piano note, and the far stranger, more unsettling possibility suggested by the guide's story and the shared experience I had apparently just had with a complete stranger standing on the other side of the room. The rest of the tour continued normally after that, moving through several more rooms, each with its own collection of historical details and occasional supernatural stories attached to it, though nothing else during the remainder of that particular tour struck me as personally strange or unexplained the way that piano sound had. By the time the tour concluded and our group began making our way back outside toward the buses, waiting to take us to our next destination, I had mostly settled into a kind of uneasy uncertainty about what exactly had happened in that room, not fully convinced one way or the other about what I had actually experienced. As everyone filed out of the house and gathered near the front porch, waiting for further instructions from our teachers, I found myself walking near the same woman who had caught my eye earlier during the tour. Feeling a mixture of curiosity and a strange need for some kind of confirmation, I approached her and asked, a little hesitantly, about the gesture she had made earlier, wanting to know for certain whether she had actually heard the same sound I had, or whether I had simply misread her expression and gesture in the moment. She confirmed it, clearly, and without any hesitation, telling me that yes, she had heard exactly the same sound I described. A single clear piano note ringing out several times during that part of the tour. Distinct enough from the general background noise of the room that she had been certain someone else nearby must have heard it too, which was why she had looked around and eventually caught my eye across the room. What struck me most, though, was what she told me next, that despite standing right beside her own husband and son throughout that entire portion of the tour, neither of them had heard anything unusual at all, the exact same situation I had experienced with my own friend standing right beside me. We stood there for a few minutes near the porch, comparing notes on what we had each heard, both a little unsettled by how closely our separate experiences matched, despite being complete strangers standing on opposite sides of a crowded room, and both slightly disturbed by the fact that the people standing closest to each of us, the people you would most expect to hear the exact same sounds we were hearing, given how physically close they were standing, had apparently heard nothing at all. Neither of us had a good explanation for why that might be the case, and neither of us has ever really settled on one in all the years since. At least as far as I know, Since I never saw or spoke to that woman again after that day, our brief shared experience, beginning and ending entirely within the walls of that one old plantation house. I have thought about that afternoon many times over the years since, especially whenever the subject of haunted places or unexplained experiences comes up in conversation. I am not someone who spends much time actively believing in ghosts or actively seeking out that kind of experience, and I did not go into that tour expecting anything genuinely strange to happen beyond the usual entertaining, slightly theatrical stories tour guides often tell at supposedly haunted locations to keep visitors engaged and a little thrilled. But something did happen that day, something I still cannot fully explain. A sound that I heard clearly and repeatedly, that my closest friend standing right beside me did not hear at all, and that a complete stranger standing across the room somehow heard at the exact same moments I did, despite her own family standing right next to her, hearing nothing. Whether it really was the lingering presence of a soldier who once played piano in that same house long ago, or something else entirely that I have no real name or explanation for, I honestly do not know, and I suspect I never fully will. What I do know is that whenever anyone asks me if I have ever experienced anything genuinely unexplainable, that afternoon at Myrtle's plantation is always the first thing that comes to mind. A memory that has stayed remarkably clear and detailed in my mind across all the years since. In a way, most memories from that particular school trip, and honestly from that entire period of my childhood, simply have not. I work at Myrtle's plantation, a job that has given me more strange stories over the years than I ever expected when I first started. Mostly stories told to me directly by guests who stay overnight in the house, since parts of the property still operate the way a bed and breakfast would, offering visitors the chance to actually sleep within the walls of a place widely considered to be one of the most haunted locations in the entire country. Working here long enough, you start to hear the same kinds of reports over and over. Footsteps in empty hallways, cold spots that appear and disappear without explanation, faint sounds of conversation or music coming from rooms that are completely empty at the time. Most of these stories blend together after a while, similar enough in their details that they start to feel like variations on a theme rather than anything that truly stands out. But there is one story connected to one very specific room in the house that still gives me a chill every single time I think about it, no matter how many times I have already heard it repeated by different guests over the years. That particular room is one of several bedrooms in the house set aside for overnight guests, and it happens to be decorated, among other things, with a fairly large collection of old ceramic dolls, the antique kind with painted porcelain faces, glass eyes, and old-fashioned clothing, arranged carefully around the room on shelves and in a couple of display cases. Ceramic dolls like that already tend to unsettle a lot of people, even under completely ordinary circumstances. Something about the fixed, unmoving expressions and the slightly too realistic eyes that many people find quietly creepy, even without any ghost story attached to them. In this particular room, though, there is one specific doll that carries a history far more significant than simple decoration. A history that connects directly and personally to the house's past in a way the other dolls in that same room do not. According to what has been passed down and documented about the history of the house, that specific doll originally belonged to a young child who lived in the house many years ago, long before it ever became any kind of public tour site or bed and breakfast. From what has been told to me, that particular doll was the child's clear favorite among whatever toys she owned, kept close to her constantly, and most importantly for this story, kept in bed with her every single night as she slept, the way many young children form a deep, specific attachment to one particular toy above all others they own. The child eventually died, under circumstances that are honestly too long and too complicated to fully get into here. The kind of sad story that unfortunately connects to a lot of the history at a place like this. Given how old the house is and how much life, in every sense of that word, has passed through it over the generations. What matters most for this particular story is that after the child died, that same doll remained on the bed in that same room, left in place as a kind of quiet, lasting memorial to her, undisturbed for a long stretch of time afterward. When the property eventually began hosting overnight guests as part of its bed and breakfast operations, decades later, the decision was made to keep that same doll exactly where it had always been, resting on the bed in that same room, partly out of simple respect for the history connected to it, and partly, I suspect, because nobody working here at the time fully understood just how directly connected to that history the doll would continue to remain, even with an entirely new set of strangers sleeping in that room every single night going forward. The first real incident connected to that doll that I know of, the one that started the pattern repeating itself with new guests over the years since, involved a woman staying in that room fairly early on after the property began welcoming overnight visitors. Like most people would, faced with sharing a bed with an old ceramic doll sitting right where she wanted to sleep, she simply picked the doll up and moved it a short distance away, setting it down somewhere else in the room so she could get comfortable in the bed without an old porcelain figure sitting right beside her all night. This is such an obvious, practical thing to do that it is hard to imagine any guest staying in that room without knowing its full history, reacting any differently. The next morning, according to what has been told to me and to countless other guests over the years since, that same doll was found back on the bed exactly where it had originally been sitting the night before, positioned this time with its small ceramic hands resting directly against the woman's throat as she woke up. As you can imagine, she came out of that room absolutely furious and deeply shaken, immediately accusing the staff of having entered her room during the night and played some kind of disturbing prank on her, moving the doll back and positioning it in that unsettling way specifically to frighten her. The staff, understandably, denied any involvement at all, and when the situation was looked into more carefully afterward, it became clear that nobody had entered or exited that particular room at any point during the night in question. The door had remained locked from the inside the entire time, the way any guest room naturally would with the guests sleeping inside, and there was no indication whatsoever of anyone else having been in that room between the time she moved the doll before falling asleep and the moment she woke up to find it back on the bed beside her, its small hands positioned so precisely and deliberately against her throat. That first incident alone would have been more than enough to make that room's reputation among the staff here, but it was far from the only time something similar happened. Not long after that first guest's experience, another visitor stayed in that same room, and being entirely unaware of what had happened previously. Since the staff at the time were understandably a little hesitant to openly advertise that kind of story to every incoming guest, he also simply moved the doll off the bed before settling down to sleep for the night. The same ordinary, practical reaction anyone would have. Sometime in the middle of that night, he woke up to the sound of a soft but distinct tapping noise coming from somewhere on the wooden floor of the room. A rhythmic, repeated sound that pulled him fully awake in the darkness. Sitting up and looking around the room to try to locate the source of the sound, he found the same doll he had moved earlier that evening, now sitting on the floor, positioned in the exact spot where the tapping sound had seemed to be coming from, despite him having placed it somewhere entirely different and higher off the ground before going to sleep. Since that time, this same basic pattern has apparently continued to repeat itself with a fairly consistent regularity whenever new guests, unaware of the doll's history, choose to move it off the bed before settling in for the night in that room. Some guests report waking up to find it back on the bed exactly where it originally sat. Others, like that second guest, report strange sounds during the night that lead them to discover the doll has somehow relocated itself to some new position within the room, always seemingly working its way, whether immediately or gradually over the course of the night, back toward its original spot on the bed, the same spot where it apparently slept alongside that young child so many years ago. I have heard variations of this same basic story directly from a good number of guests over the years I have worked here, each of them arriving independently at their own version of the same conclusion, that this particular doll, more than any of the many other old, admittedly unsettling-looking dolls scattered throughout that same room, seems to hold on to something the others simply do not. Some lingering connection, whether you want to call it a memory, a habit, or something else entirely, that continues expressing itself in exactly the same way. Night after night, guest after guest, whenever someone unknowingly disturbs its long-standing place on that bed. What I personally find most unsettling about this particular story, more than any single individual account of the doll moving or reappearing, is the sheer consistency of it across so many different guests over such a long stretch of time. People who have never met each other, who stayed in that room years apart from one another, who had no way of comparing notes or influencing each other's expectations beforehand, and who nonetheless keep arriving at remarkably similar experiences whenever they make the same simple, practical decision to move that doll before going to sleep. It is one thing to hear a single strange story from a single guest and wonder about coincidence, misperception, or an overactive imagination reacting to an admittedly creepy old room full of antique dolls. It is another thing entirely to hear that same basic pattern repeated, with only small variations in the specific details, by guest after guest across years of working here myself. We do still occasionally get guests who specifically request that room, drawn by its reputation rather than put off by it. Some of them hoping, in a strange way, to have their own experience with the doll to add to the long list of similar stories already connected to that room. Most of them do move the doll at some point during their stay, whether out of simple habit or specifically to test whether the stories they have heard turn out to be true for them as well. And more often than not, by the time they check out the next morning, they have their own version of the story to tell. Their own account of waking up to find that same old ceramic doll exactly where it always seems determined to end up, back on that bed, back in the place it apparently still considers, in whatever sense makes sense for something like this, to be its rightful spot beside whoever happens to be sleeping there that particular night. I do not know exactly what to make of it myself, even after hearing so many versions of essentially the same story over the years. I am not someone who came into this job already believing firmly in ghosts or spirits, and plenty of the stories I hear from guests during any given week are the kind of thing that could easily be explained away by an old, creaky house, an unfamiliar environment, playing tricks on tired, unfamiliar minds, or a simple suggestion working its way into someone's experience after hearing enough about the house's reputation before ever arriving. But the story of that particular doll has always felt different to me, more consistent, more specific, and honestly, more difficult to explain away, no matter how many times I try to find some ordinary explanation that accounts for all of it. Whenever new staff start working here and begin learning the various stories connected to different rooms throughout the house, that particular doll in its bedroom is always one I make a point of explaining carefully and completely, partly out of simple practical necessity, since guests do occasionally come out of that room asking pointed questions the next morning, and partly, I will admit, because it remains the one story out of everything I have heard and collected over my years working here that I genuinely cannot shake. The one that still crosses my mind every single time I happen to walk past that particular room during my shifts, especially late in the evening, when the house grows quiet and the guests staying that night have already retreated to their rooms for the evening, leaving the rest of the old house settling into its usual familiar stillness around them. I have told this particular story before in a different conversation a while back, but it feels like it belongs here just as much, maybe even more, since it is one of those stories that has stuck with me for years, despite being fairly short and simple compared to a lot of the longer, more elaborate ghost stories people tend to tell. It happened to one of my closest childhood friends, someone I grew up with and spent a huge amount of time around during those years, which is part of why the story has always felt so personal and real to me, even though I was not actually present for the event itself. He told it to me directly, more than once over the years, always with the same quiet, serious tone that made it clear this was not something he was exaggerating or embellishing for effect. My friend grew up with a younger brother who was born with a number of serious health complications, including multiple sclerosis, a condition that had a severe and lasting impact on him from a very young age. Because of the severity of his condition, his younger brother required a wheelchair to get around and was unable to care for himself in the ways most children eventually learn to do as they grow older, needing consistent, close supervision and support from his family throughout his entire childhood. Given how much care and attention his younger brother needed, especially overnight, my friend's parents made the decision, when the boys were still fairly young, to have the two brothers share a single bedroom, positioning my friend's own bed close enough to his younger brother's crib that he could act as an extra set of eyes and ears during the night, ready to alert his parents quickly if anything seemed wrong while they were asleep in another part of the house. This arrangement had been going on for a while by the time the specific incident I am about to describe took place, long enough that sharing a room with his younger brother and occasionally waking during the night to check on him had become a fairly normal part of my friend's routine, something he had grown accustomed to without much fear or worry attached to it. He always described his younger brother's health struggles as something the whole family had learned to live around, adjusting their daily routines in their home in whatever ways were necessary, without the constant sense of danger or crisis that outsiders might assume comes along with caring for a child with such serious medical needs. On the particular night this story centers around, my friend told me he woke up suddenly in the middle of the night for no clear reason at all. No loud noise, no dream he could specifically remember. Nothing that obviously explained why he had suddenly opened his eyes at that particular moment, rather than continuing to sleep straight through until morning the way he usually did. He said it felt almost like his body simply decided, on its own, that he needed to wake up right then. An experience many people describe having at least once in their lives, waking abruptly from a deep sleep with no obvious external cause, as though some instinct deeper than conscious thought had pulled them out of sleep for a reason they cannot immediately identify. Lying there in the dark bedroom he shared with his younger brother, still groggy and only half alert, he glanced over toward his brother's crib, a habit built up over months of sharing that same room together. A quick, automatic check to make sure everything seemed normal before potentially drifting back off to sleep himself. What he saw in that glance immediately snapped him fully awake, chasing away whatever remaining grogginess had still been clinging to him a moment before. Standing outside the window, directly behind his younger brother's crib, visible only as a dark silhouette against the faint outside light, was the clear shape of a man. Not a shapeless shadow or an ambiguous trick of light and darkness that could easily be explained away as some ordinary object or shape misread by tired eyes, but a distinctly human-shaped silhouette, tall and still, wearing what my friend described very specifically and consistently every time he told the story as an old-fashioned top hat. The kind you might see in old photographs or period films, rather than anything anyone in their neighborhood would actually be wearing on an ordinary night. The figure was simply standing there, motionless, positioned directly behind the crib, seemingly looking downward into it, toward where his younger brother lay sleeping, or at least where my friend assumed he was sleeping at that exact moment, since his attention had immediately locked on to that strange silhouette in the window rather than on his brother directly. Their bedroom, importantly, was located on an upper floor of the house, high enough off the ground that there was no normal, practical way for an actual person to simply be standing outside that particular window. No porch roof beneath it. No ladder or structure of any kind that would allow someone to stand at that height and look directly into their room from outside. My friend said his entire body reacted before his mind had even fully processed what he was looking at. A wave of pure, instinctive fear washing over him at the sight of that still, silent figure standing impossibly outside their upper floor window. He did not stop to think, did not pause to look more closely or try to rationalize what he was seeing. Instead, he immediately jumped out of his own bed, reached over, and turned on the bedroom light as quickly as he possibly could, some deep instinct telling him that light, any light at all, needed to fill that room immediately. He told me he did not even look back toward the window once the light came on, too afraid of what he might see if the figure was somehow still standing there, illuminated now by the sudden brightness rather than hidden safely in darkness. Instead, he ran straight out of the bedroom and down the hallway toward his parents' room, bursting in and waking them urgently, trying to explain through his own panic and confusion exactly what he had just seen standing outside the window behind his brother's crib. His parents, understandably alarmed by their son's obvious terror, even if they did not yet fully understand what had caused it, got up immediately and followed him quickly back toward the bedroom he shared with his younger brother, moving with the kind of urgency any parent would when their child comes to them in the middle of the night, clearly frightened and insistent that something is wrong. When they entered the room together, the strange silhouette my friend had seen in the window was gone. Nothing visible outside except ordinary darkness. No figure. No evidence that anyone or anything had actually been standing there at all. But what they found instead, the moment their attention shifted from the empty window toward the crib itself, was far more immediately urgent and frightening than any lingering question about a strange shape outside the glass. My friend's younger brother was in the middle of having a seizure right there in his crib, his small body shaking uncontrollably, a medical emergency that required his parents' immediate and full attention, pulling their focus away almost entirely from whatever my friend had seen only moments before and toward the more pressing, tangible crisis actually unfolding in front of them. The rest of that night, as my friend described it to me, became a blur of medical urgency, calling for help and generally managing the immediate crisis of his younger brother's seizure, the kind of situation his family had unfortunately dealt with before, given his brother's ongoing health condition, though it never became any less frightening no matter how many times it happened. Once things had finally settled, once his younger brother had been checked over and the immediate danger had passed, there was little time or energy left that night to focus on the strange figure my friend had seen standing outside the window just before the seizure began, though he never stopped thinking about it himself, even as the rest of his family's attention understandably remained focused on his brother's health in the days that followed. In the time since that night, different members of my friend's family have come to hold very different interpretations of what that silhouette in the window might have actually been. Several relatives, when the story eventually came up in conversation, offered a comforting explanation, suggesting that the figure my friend saw might have been some kind of guardian presence watching over his younger brother, present specifically in that critical moment before the seizure began, perhaps even helping to ensure my friend woke up when he did, giving the family the extra warning time they needed to respond quickly to what was happening in the crib. This interpretation, framing the strange figure as something protective rather than threatening, has apparently brought a fair amount of comfort to some in the family over the years, a way of finding some meaning or reassurance within an otherwise deeply unsettling memory. My friend himself, however, has never been able to fully accept that more comforting explanation, no matter how many times other family members have suggested it to him over the years. He has always maintained, with a quiet, serious conviction whenever he tells this story, that what he saw standing outside that window that night felt nothing like protection or guardianship to him in the moment. Instead, he has always described the feeling that overtook him upon seeing that still, silent, top-hatted silhouette as something closer to a direct, personal sense of dread, an instinctive, primal certainty that whatever he was looking at represented danger, or perhaps even death itself. Standing quietly at the window in the moments just before his younger brother's body began to seize uncontrollably in the crib below it. He has told me more than once that he still does not know, and probably never will know for certain, whether that figure was somehow connected to the seizure that followed almost immediately afterward, whether it was some kind of warning, some kind of presence drawn toward that specific crisis about to unfold, or simply an unrelated, deeply strange coincidence that happened to occur at nearly the exact same moment his younger brother's health took its own frightening turn that particular night. What he has always been certain of, though, every single time he has told me this story over the years, going all the way back to when we were kids ourselves, is exactly what he saw. A tall, still, human-shaped silhouette wearing an old-fashioned top hat, standing impossibly outside an upper-floor window, looking down into his younger brother's crib in the darkness, gone by the time any other adult arrived to see it for themselves. I have always found this particular story deeply unsettling myself, even though, as I mentioned, I was never actually present for any part of it, hearing it entirely secondhand from a friend I trust and have known for the vast majority of my life. There is something about the specific, consistent detail of that top hat especially that has always stuck with me more than almost any other detail in any other ghost story I have ever heard. An oddly formal, almost old-fashioned touch that makes the figure feel less like a vague, shapeless shadow and more like something deliberately, specifically present, dressed in a way that feels intentional rather than accidental or easily explained away by ordinary shadows and half-asleep eyes. Whether that figure really was some kind of guardian watching protectively over a vulnerable child during a medical crisis, or whether it truly was, as my friend has always quietly believed, something closer to death itself standing patiently at the window that night, I do not think anyone in that family, or anyone who has heard this story secondhand the way I originally did, will ever really be able to say for certain. What I do know is that whenever my friend tells this particular story, even now, so many years after it originally happened, there is a specific weight to the way he tells it, a seriousness that never fully lifts, no matter how many times he has already shared it before, making it clear that whatever he saw that night in their shared childhood bedroom has never fully left him, no matter how much time has passed since.